Religious and spiritual interpretations of Atlantis have evolved from seeing it as evidence of biblical flood narratives to viewing it as a metaphor for spiritual evolution and decline. New Age spirituality has particularly embraced Atlantis as a source of ancient wisdom, with channelers claiming to receive messages from Atlantean spirits, crystal healers attributing their practices to Atlantean science, and spiritual seekers traveling to supposed Atlantean sites seeking enlightenment. While academics might dismiss such beliefs, they demonstrate the myth's continuing power to inspire spiritual seeking and self-transformation. The economic dimensions of the Atlantis myth speak to perennial concerns about inequality, exploitation, and the corrupting effects of wealth. Plato's description of Atlantis's decline included increasing materialism, the replacement of justice with power, and the exploitation of subject peoples for the benefit of a wealthy elite. These themes resonate in every era of economic inequality from the Gilded Age to the present, with Atlantis serving as a warning about what happens when economic systems prioritize accumulation over distribution, competition over cooperation. The political uses of the Atlantis myth have been varied and sometimes troubling, with different ideologies claiming Atlantean heritage or using the story to support their programs. Nationalists have claimed their peoples descended from Atlantean survivors. Supremacists have used supposed Atlantean superiority to justify racism, and authoritarians have pointed to Atlantis's fall as evidence that democracy leads to chaos. Yet the myth has also inspired democratic and egalitarian visions, with reformers using Atlantis's fate to argue for social justice, international cooperation, and limits on power. The scientific impact of Atlantis research, despite skepticism about the continent's existence, has been surprisingly positive. The search for Atlantis has motivated exploration of unmapped regions, development of new technologies, and interdisciplinary collaboration between fields that might otherwise remain separate. Marine archaeology, underwater photography, satellite imaging, and countless other scientific advances have been driven partly by the quest to find lost civilizations. Even failed searches have produced valuable data about ocean floors, ancient coastlines, and prehistoric human settlements. The educational value of the Atlantis myth lies in its capacity to engage students with questions about evidence, interpretation, and the construction of historical knowledge. Examining the Atlantis story requires critical thinking about sources, understanding of how myths develop and spread, and appreciation for the difference between historical fact and meaningful fiction. The myth serves as a gateway drug to classics, introducing readers to Plato and ancient philosophy through an engaging narrative that raises profound questions about human nature and social organization. The cultural anthropology of Atlantis belief reveals patterns in how societies construct and maintain myths that serve psychological and social functions regardless of their historical accuracy. The tendency to believe in lost golden ages, ancient wisdom, and catastrophic falls appears across cultures, suggesting these narratives fulfill important needs for meaning, warning, and hope. Studying why people believe in Atlantis, what version they prefer, and how they use the myth reveals as much about contemporary society as about ancient history. The linguistic legacy of Atlantis extends beyond the word itself, entering languages worldwide as a synonym for things lost or unattainable. Phrases like "searching for Atlantis" denote quixotic quests. Atlantean describes things of impossible grandeur or antiquity, and "to sink like Atlantis" means to disappear completely and suddenly. The myth has enriched human language with metaphors for expressing ideas about loss, ambition, and the fragility of achievement that might otherwise be difficult to articulate. The artistic inspiration drawn from Atlantis has produced countless paintings, sculptures, musical compositions, and architectural designs attempting to capture the lost continent's imagined splendor. From Thomas Cole's romantic paintings of an idealized ancient civilization to contemporary digital art depicting underwater ruins inhabited by merpeople, artists have used Atlantis as a canvas for exploring beauty, decay, and the sublime. The impossibility of depicting something that never existed has paradoxically freed artists to express their most ambitious visions. The comparative mythology perspective on Atlantis reveals it as one example of a universal pattern, the paradise lost through human failing that might yet be recovered through proper action. Whether compared to Lemuria, Mu, Shambhala, or other lost continents and hidden kingdoms, Atlantis stands out for its detailed description, philosophical framework, and attribution to a known historical source. This combination of specificity and ambiguity has made it the archetypal lost civilization, the standard against which all others are measured. The question of why the Atlantis legend endures when so many other ancient stories have been forgotten leads to the heart of its significance. Unlike purely mythological tales of gods and monsters, Atlantis was presented as history, occurring in a specific time and place, involving human beings much like ourselves. Unlike purely historical accounts of fallen cities and vanished peoples, Atlantis carried profound moral and philosophical weight, its fall resulting from moral rather than merely military failure. This combination of the historical and mythological, the human and divine, the specific and universal, has given the story unique staying power. The modern proliferation of Atlantis theories in the age of the internet has created a kind of democratic mythology where anyone can propose their own version, find evidence to support it, and gather believers around their interpretation. This has led to both productive crowdsourced research and the spread of misinformation, both genuine discoveries and elaborate hoaxes. The internet has become a kind of Alexandria library for Atlantis lore, preserving every theory, every claimed discovery, every reinterpretation for future researchers to examine. The psychological need for mystery in an increasingly mapped and measured world helps explain Atlantis's continuing appeal. As satellite imaging and deep-sea exploration eliminate blank spaces on maps, as science explains phenomena once attributed to gods and magic, as the information age makes all knowledge seemingly accessible, the human psyche rebels against complete disenchantment. Atlantis represents the possibility that great mysteries remain, that transformative discoveries await, that the world still holds wonders beyond current understanding. The sociological function of the Atlantis myth in creating communities of believers and seekers has become increasingly important in an atomized modern world. Atlantis conferences, online forums, expedition groups, and research societies provide social connection for people united by shared fascination with the mystery. These communities offer belonging, purpose, and identity to members who might otherwise feel isolated in their interests. The search for Atlantis becomes less important than the searching community itself. The philosophical question of whether Atlantis should be found touches on profound issues about the relationship between mystery and meaning, between seeking and finding, between imagination and reality. Would discovering the actual Atlantis, if it existed, enhance or diminish its cultural significance? Would proof that it never existed end its influence or simply transform it into pure symbol? The myth's power might lie precisely in its indeterminacy, its existence in the space between fact and fiction, where imagination can operate most freely. The ecological message of Atlantis grows more relevant as humanity faces challenges that threaten civilization on a global scale. Climate change, resource depletion, biodiversity loss, and other environmental crises echo the natural disasters that destroyed Atlantis, while political polarization, economic inequality, and social fragmentation recall the moral decay that preceded the physical destruction. The myth asks whether modern civilization is repeating Atlantean mistakes, whether technology and prosperity are blinding us to approaching catastrophe. The transhumanist interpretation of Atlantis sees it as representing a previous peak of human evolution that might be regained through technology or spiritual development. In this reading, Atlantean capabilities, whether psychic powers, advanced technology, or perfect wisdom, represent human potential temporarily lost but recoverable. This optimistic vision transforms Atlantis from cautionary tale to inspirational goal, from paradise lost to paradise postponed, awaiting rediscovery, not beneath the ocean but within human possibility. The final meditation on what Atlantis means for human memory and civilization brings us full circle to Plato's original purpose in telling the story. Memory, both individual and collective, shapes identity and guides action. Civilizations that forget their histories repeat their mistakes, while those that remember too rigidly cannot adapt to new challenges. Atlantis represents both the importance of memory, preserved through Egyptian records and Greek philosophy, and the fragility of memory, lost beneath waves of time and catastrophe. The story reminds us that civilizations, no matter how powerful, are temporary arrangements dependent on maintaining delicate balances between human ambition and natural limits, between individual desire and collective need, between preserving tradition and embracing change. Every civilization believes itself permanent, its values universal, its achievements lasting. Atlantis warns that this belief is always illusion, that permanence exists only in the cycles of rise and fall, creation and destruction, memory and forgetting that characterize human existence. Perhaps the deepest truth of Atlantis is not whether it existed, but why we need it to exist, what its existence or non-existence says about human nature and aspiration. We are creatures who build cities and tell stories about cities, who create civilizations and myths about civilizations, who simultaneously reach toward divinity and remain rooted in mortality. Atlantis embodies this duality, this tension between what we are and what we imagine we could be, between what we have achieved and what we have lost. In the end, Atlantis is less about a place than about a process, less about a civilization than about civilization itself. It is the eternal story of human ambition exceeding human wisdom, of power corrupting its possessors, of the past haunting the present with both warnings and promises. Every society is Atlantis in potential, carrying within itself the seeds of both greatness and destruction. The choice of which seeds we nurture, which patterns we repeat or transcend, remains always before us. As we face our own civilizational challenges, as we build our towers ever higher and dig our foundations ever deeper, as we transform nature and ourselves in ways previous generations could not imagine, the ghost of Atlantis watches from beneath the waves of time. It does not tell us what will happen, but reminds us that what has happened can happen again, that the ocean of possibility contains both paradise and catastrophe, that the same waters that sustain life can swallow civilizations without trace. The search for Atlantis continues not because we expect to find a sunken city, but because in searching we discover truths about ourselves, our past, and our possible futures. Each generation will retell the story according to its needs, find new meanings in old words, discover new warnings or promises in the ancient tale. Atlantis will remain eternally lost and eternally present, forever sinking and forever calling to us from beneath waves that are simultaneously water and time, memory and imagination, history and myth. And so the story of Atlantis ends where it began, with an old philosopher in an olive grove telling his students about a conversation between ancient priests and a traveling sage, about records preserved in temples and memories transmitted across generations, about a great island that once ruled the Western Ocean and vanished in a single day and night of misfortune. The story spreads outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each retelling adding new layers of meaning, while the original truth, if there was an original truth, sinks ever deeper beneath accumulating interpretations. Yet perhaps this is as it should be, for the greatest stories are those that grow in the telling, that adapt to new circumstances while preserving eternal truths, that speak simultaneously to the historical particular and the mythological universal. Atlantis has become such a story, a narrative so rich and multifaceted that it can never be exhausted, never be definitively proven or disproven, never lose its power to inspire, warn, and enchant. In this sense, Plato's Atlantis achieved a different kind of immortality than its builders sought, surviving not in stone and metal, but in the more durable medium of human imagination, where it will remain as long as people tell stories about what was, what might have been, and what could yet be. The waves close over Atlantis, but the story continues, carried on currents of words and dreams to shores not yet imagined, to listeners not yet born, to futures where new Atlantises will rise and fall, each believing itself the first and the last, each adding its own chapter to the endless story of human aspiration and human limitation. And in those future times, as in our own, as in Plato's, someone will speak of a great island civilization that once was and is no more, and someone will listen and wonder, and the ancient mystery will be renewed, as fresh and compelling as if it were being told for the first time under Mediterranean stars, while somewhere beneath unknown waters Atlantis waits, neither existing nor not existing, eternal in its ambiguity, perfect in its incompleteness, forever almost found, forever just lost, forever Atlantis. The geography of Atlantis, as described in these ancient records, extended far beyond the central island itself. The Atlantean Empire had controlled numerous other islands scattered throughout the Atlantic, creating a network of territories that facilitated their dominance of maritime trade routes. Each of these subsidiary islands had its own governor, appointed from the noble families of Atlantis, who administered local affairs while maintaining loyalty to the central authority. This political structure had allowed the Atlanteans to maintain control over vast distances without the immediate presence of military force. The climate across the Atlantean territories had varied considerably, from tropical regions in the south to more temperate zones in the north. This diversity had provided the empire with access to a wide range of natural resources and agricultural products, contributing to their economic strength and self-sufficiency. The Atlanteans had learned to adapt their agricultural and architectural techniques to different environments, showing a flexibility and innovative capacity that served them well in their expansion. The divine origins of Atlantis stretched back to an age when gods walked more freely upon the earth, intervening directly in human affairs and shaping the destiny of mortals through their passions and desires. According to the sacred histories preserved in the Egyptian temples, the island that would become Atlantis had originally been inhabited by primitive peoples who lived simply, unaware of the extraordinary fate that awaited their homeland. These early inhabitants possessed no special distinction, no great cities or monuments, living instead in scattered settlements where they fished the coastal waters and cultivated small plots of land. The transformation of this unremarkable island into the mighty empire of Atlantis began with Poseidon, the earth shaker, lord of all the waters that surrounded the land. The god had been surveying his domain, travelling through the waves in his chariot drawn by hippocampi, those magnificent creatures that were half horse and half fish, when his attention was drawn to this particular island. Something about the place appealed to him, perhaps the way the sunlight played upon its shores, or the particular music of the waves against its cliffs. As Poseidon explored the island, moving invisibly among its mortal inhabitants, he discovered in its centre a small mountain where lived a family of particular virtue and beauty. The parents, Evenor and Leucippe, had been born on the island and had lived their entire lives in honest labour and simple devotion to the gods. They had been blessed with a single child, a daughter named Cleito, who had grown into a maiden of extraordinary beauty and grace. Her beauty was not merely physical, but seemed to radiate from an inner purity that made her shine like a jewel among common stones. When Evenor and Leucippe died, leaving Cleito orphaned and alone, Poseidon revealed himself to her, appearing not in his full divine glory, which would have been too terrible for mortal eyes to bear, but in a form of such perfect masculine beauty that Cleito knew immediately she stood before a god. The Earthshaker spoke to her with a voice like distant thunder, like waves crashing against stone, yet also with unexpected gentleness. He declared his love for her and his intention to make her his bride, promising that their union would produce a lineage of heroes who would rule over a great nation. Cleito accepted the god's proposal, understanding that to be chosen by one of the immortals was both a tremendous honor and a fate that could not be refused. Poseidon then set about transforming the mountain where Cleito lived into a dwelling place suitable for his bride. With his divine power, he reshaped the earth itself, carving the hill into the series of concentric rings that would later become the model for the great capital city. He caused springs of water to flow from the earth, one hot and one cold, ensuring that Cleito would never lack for comfort or refreshment. The gods surrounded these rings with walls of earth and channels of water, creating a fortress that no mortal could breach, protecting his beloved from any possible harm. He caused the soil to bring forth every kind of fruit and grain in abundance, so that Cleito lived in a paradise where hunger was unknown and every season brought its own delights. Trees grew tall and straight, providing shade and timber, while flowering plants filled the air with perfume and attracted birds whose songs created a constant symphony of natural music. In this divinely crafted paradise, Cleito bore Poseidon 10 sons, 5 sets of twins, each child carrying within them the blend of mortal and immortal blood that would make them superior to ordinary humans in strength, wisdom, and longevity. These children grew to maturity with remarkable speed, displaying from their earliest years abilities that marked them as more than mortal. They could run faster than horses, swim through the roughest seas without tiring, and possessed minds that could grasp complex concepts with ease. When the 10 sons reached adulthood, Poseidon divided the island of Atlantis among them, granting each a portion to rule as his own kingdom. However, he designated special honors for the eldest of the first set of twins, a son named Atlas, whose strength and wisdom surpassed even those of his remarkable brothers. To Atlas, Poseidon gave the central portion of the island, including the sacred mountain where Cleito dwelt, and the rings of land and water that surrounded it. He also granted Atlas sovereignty over his brothers, making him the high king to whom the others would owe allegiance. From Atlas came the name of both the island empire and the ocean that surrounded it. The Greeks would later know this body of water as the Atlantic, the Sea of Atlas, acknowledging the primacy of this first king even thousands of years after his death. The Egyptian priests emphasized to Solon that this naming was not merely honorary, but reflected a deep truth about the relationship between the royal line and the very waters that had given them power. Each of Atlas's brothers received his own territory and took a wife from among the most noble of the island's inhabitants, establishing dynasties that would rule for countless generations. The second twin of the first pair, Eumelus in the Greek tongue, though called Gadairus in the Atlantean language, received the portion of the island nearest to the Pillars of Hercules. Ampheres and Evaemon, the second pair of twins, were granted territories in the eastern portions of the island. Meneceus and Autochthon, the third pair, ruled in the west, while Eleusippus and Mestor, the fourth pair, controlled northern territories. The youngest twins, Azias and Diaprepes, were given the southern regions. These 10 kingdoms, while autonomous in their internal affairs, were bound together by sacred laws that Poseidon himself had established. These laws had been inscribed by the god's own hand upon a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the temple dedicated to him at the center of the capital city. The writing glowed with an inner light that never dimmed, and the letters could be read equally well in darkness or in daylight, ensuring that none could claim ignorance of the divine commandments. The laws established by Poseidon addressed both the relationships between the 10 kingdoms and the principles by which each should be governed. No kingdom was permitted to wage war against another, and all were obligated to come to the defense of any that was attacked by foreign enemies. The High King in the line of Atlas held the authority to convene councils and to make final decisions in matters affecting the entire empire, but he could not act arbitrarily against any of his fellow kings without the consent of the majority. Every 5th and 6th year alternately, thus giving equal honor to both odd and even numbers, the 10 kings would gather at the temple of Poseidon for a great ceremony that renewed their commitment to these sacred laws. This gathering was not merely a political assembly, but a religious ritual of profound significance, connecting the rulers directly to their divine progenitor and reinforcing the supernatural foundations of their authority. The ceremony began at sunset, with the 10 kings alone in the temple precinct, all other persons having been sent away to ensure the privacy and sanctity of the rite. In the temple courtyard roamed sacred bulls, animals dedicated to Poseidon, that were allowed to wander freely within the consecrated space. These bulls were magnificent specimens chosen for their size, strength, and the perfection of their forms, and they were treated with the reverence due to creatures touched by divinity. The kings would spend the first portion of the night in prayer and meditation, purifying themselves for the task ahead. They wore simple robes of dark blue, the color of the deep ocean, and carried no weapons except wooden clubs and ropes, for tradition dictated that no metal could be used in the capture of the sacrificial bull. This restriction served as a reminder that their power, while great, must sometimes yield to older and more fundamental forces. When the moon reached its zenith, the 10 kings would begin the hunt for the sacrificial bull. Working together, they would need to capture one of the sacred animals using only their clubs, ropes, and their own strength and cunning. This hunt within the temple grounds was both practical and symbolic, representing the need for cooperation among the kingdoms and the importance of maintaining the physical vigor and courage that had characterized their divine ancestor. Once a bull had been captured and subdued, it would be led to the pillar of orichalcum where the laws were inscribed. There, with great ceremony, the animal would be sacrificed, its blood allowed to flow over the sacred words, renewing their power and binding the kings once more to their observance. Each king would drink from a golden cup filled with wine mixed with a drop of the bull's blood, taking into themselves a portion of the sacrifice and making themselves one with the offering to Poseidon. After drinking, each king would throw his cup into a sacred fire that burned with flames of unusual colors, blues and greens that recalled the hues of the sea. They would then don robes of magnificent purple and sit in judgment through the night, hearing any complaints or disputes that had arisen between the kingdoms since their last gathering. Their decisions during these nocturnal courts were considered especially binding, as they were made under the direct influence of the divine presence invoked by the sacrifice. As dawn approached, the kings would inscribe their judgments upon tablets of gold, which would be stored in the temple archives along with the robes they had worn during the ceremony. These tablets accumulated over the centuries into a comprehensive record of Atlantean law and precedent, creating a legal tradition that grew ever more sophisticated and nuanced with each generation. The robes themselves became sacred relics, each one associated with specific decisions and moments in the empire's history. The religious life of Atlantis extended far beyond these royal ceremonies. Throughout the island, temples and shrines honored not only Poseidon, but also Plato, who had been elevated after her death to divine status as the mother of the nation. The common people made regular offerings at these shrines, usually of flowers, fruit, and incense, seeking blessings for their families, their crops, and their enterprises. The priests who maintained these temples came from all levels of society, chosen for their wisdom and devotion rather than their birth. The Atlanteans believed that their mixed divine and mortal heritage gave them both special privileges and special responsibilities. They saw themselves as intermediaries between the realm of gods and the world of ordinary mortals, charged with maintaining order and justice in the portion of the earth granted to them. This belief shaped their approach to governance, warfare, and diplomacy, always conscious that their actions were being observed and judged by their divine ancestor. The sacred calendar of Atlantis was complex, incorporating not only the regular festivals honoring Poseidon and Plato, but also celebrations specific to each of the 10 kingdoms, commemorating their founding kings and particular local traditions. The greatest festival of the year occurred on the anniversary of the island's divine transformation, when Poseidon had first shaped the rings of land and water. During this celebration, which lasted for 10 days, all work ceased except for essential services, and the entire population participated in processions, performances, and feasts. Music and dance played crucial roles in Atlantean religious practice. The priests had preserved ancient hymns that were said to have been taught to the first generation by Poseidon himself, melodies that could invoke specific spiritual states or attract divine attention. The sacred dances performed by specially trained temple dancers told the stories of the gods and the founding of Atlantis through stylized movements that had been passed down unchanged for millennia. The Atlanteans also practiced forms of divination that they believed allowed them to perceive the will of the gods. They observed the flight patterns of birds, especially seabirds that were sacred to Poseidon, and interpreted unusual weather phenomena as divine messages. The priests maintained elaborate records of omens and their outcomes, building a systematic approach to understanding divine communication that influenced decision-making at all levels of society. Education in Atlantis included extensive religious instruction, ensuring that every citizen understood their place in the cosmic order established by Poseidon. Children learned the genealogies of the royal families, tracing the bloodlines back to the original 10 sons, and memorized the fundamental laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar. They were taught that their prosperity and power depended on maintaining their devotion to the gods and adhering to the principles of justice established at the foundation of their society. The concept of divine justice was central to Atlantean thought. They believed that the gods actively monitored human behavior, rewarding virtue and punishing transgression, though not always immediately or in obvious ways. This belief created a strong ethical framework that discouraged corruption and encouraged public service, as citizens understood that their actions had consequences beyond the merely material or political. The influence of this religious worldview extended into Atlantean art and architecture. Every major building included design elements that honored the gods, from decorative motifs featuring dolphins and tridents to the careful orientation of structures according to celestial alignments. Artists were considered to be inspired by divine muses, and their works were valued not only for their beauty, but for their ability to serve as conduits between the mortal and immortal realms. The sacred geometry that Poseidon had used in creating the rings of the capital city was replicated throughout Atlantean design. Circles and concentric patterns appeared in everything from jewelry to city planning, serving as constant reminders of the divine origin of their civilization. This mathematical harmony was believed to reflect the fundamental order of the cosmos, and maintaining it in human constructions was seen as an act of worship. Marriage customs in Atlantis reflected their understanding of divine unions. While political marriages were common among the nobility, all weddings included rituals that invoked Poseidon and Cleto's blessing, asking that the couple's union might echo, in its own humble way, the sacred marriage that had founded their race. The birth of children, especially in the royal families, was surrounded by ceremonies designed to ensure that the divine blood remained strong in each new generation. The Atlanteans practiced a form of ancestor worship alongside their devotion to the gods. They believed that the spirits of the dead, especially those of great heroes and kings, continued to watch over and guide the living. Elaborate tombs were constructed for important figures, designed not merely as resting places but as homes for the deceased in the afterlife. These tombs were regularly visited by descendants who would leave offerings and seek guidance in dreams sent by their ancestors. The relationship between religious and temporal power in Atlantis was carefully balanced through institutions that had evolved over millennia. While the kings were considered semi-divine and served as high priests in certain ceremonies, they were not absolute theocrats. A separate priesthood maintained independence in purely religious matters, and there were mechanisms to prevent any single individual from claiming to be the sole interpreter of divine will. This separation of powers was tested periodically throughout Atlantean history, when particularly charismatic kings or priests attempted to expand their authority. Each time, the system established by Poseidon proved resilient, with the other power centers joining forces to restore balance. The sacred laws on the orichalcum pillar were invoked as the ultimate authority, their divine origin making them superior to any mortal interpretation or amendment. The role of women in Atlantean religion was significant, reflecting the honored position of Cleto as the mortal mother of their race. Priestesses served in temples throughout the empire, and certain mysteries were reserved exclusively for female initiates. These women's mysteries were said to preserve knowledge that Cleto had received directly from Poseidon, secrets about the nature of divine-mortal interaction that were considered too powerful or dangerous for general revelation. The Atlantean understanding of death and the afterlife was sophisticated and somewhat different from that of their contemporary civilizations. They believed in a form of reincarnation, but one influenced by the moral quality of the life lived. Those who had lived virtuously and fulfilled their duties would be reborn into higher stations, possibly even rejoining the divine bloodline if they achieved sufficient merit. Those who had lived wickedly would be reborn in lower forms, forced to work their way back to human status through multiple incarnations. This belief system created a long-term perspective that influenced Atlantean behavior in profound ways. Actions were evaluated not only for their immediate consequences, but for their effects on the soul's eternal journey. This encouraged a type of enlightened self-interest where personal advancement was understood to be best achieved through service to the common good, as the gods would ultimately judge each soul on its contribution to the harmony and prosperity of the whole. The sacred texts of Atlantis, beyond the laws on the orichalcum pillar, included epic poems recounting the deeds of Poseidon and the early kings, philosophical treatises on the nature of divinity and mortality, and practical manuals for conducting various religious ceremonies. These texts were preserved in special chambers within the temples, copied and recopied by scribes who underwent purification rituals before handling the sacred words. The physical manifestation of Atlantean power and divine favor reached its most magnificent expression in the architecture of their great capital city. Rising from the sea like a jewel set in rings of silver and gold, the city represented not merely human ambition, but an attempt to create on earth a reflection of the divine realms. Every stone that was laid, every canal that was dug, every bridge that spanned the waters had been placed according to principles that united practical function with sacred geometry, creating a living testament to the harmony between mortal craft and immortal design. The outermost ring of land, which faced the open sea, stretched 3 stadia in width, and served as the first line of defense against any potential invaders. Here, the Atlanteans had constructed a wall that ran along the entire circumference, a massive fortification that rose 50 cubits from its foundation and was thick enough that 2 chariots could pass each other comfortably on its top. This wall was not built of simple stone, but was faced entirely with brass, a coating that had been applied using techniques that remained mysterious even to the learned Egyptian priests who preserved these records. The brass covering had been polished to such a degree that it acted as a vast mirror, reflecting the sky and sea in ways that changed throughout the day. At dawn, the wall would glow with rosy light, while at sunset it burned with colors of flame. During storms, it would reflect the dark clouds and lightning, becoming a ring of tempest that warned approaching ships of the power contained within. The psychological effect of this gleaming barrier cannot be understated, as it announced to all who approached that they were entering a realm where normal human limitations had been transcended. Behind this brass wall, the outer ring contained the quarters of the maritime population, those whose lives were devoted to the sea that was Atlantis's highway to wealth and power. Here lived the sailors, shipbuilders, dock workers, and all those whose labor maintained the vast fleet that was the pride of the empire. The buildings in this district were constructed with practicality foremost in mind, yet even these utilitarian structures displayed the Atlantean genius for combining function with beauty. The houses were built of stone quarried from beneath the rings themselves, creating a honeycomb of chambers and passages beneath the city that served multiple purposes. The white, black, and red stone that emerged from these quarries was not scattered randomly, but was used deliberately to create patterns and designs that pleased the eye, while also conveying information about the purpose and ownership of different buildings. A house with red stone foundations and black walls topped with white, for instance, might indicate a naval captain's residence, while other combinations denoted different ranks and professions. The great harbour, which could accommodate 1,200 warships simultaneously, had been carved from the solid rock of the outer ring, creating a basin of such perfect proportions that the water within remained calm even when storms raged in the open ocean. Beyond, the entrance to this harbour was only 50 feet wide, barely enough for a single ship to pass, but this narrow opening was deliberate, allowing the Atlanteans to control absolutely who entered and left their port. On either side of this entrance rose towers of impressive height, topped with mechanisms that could lower a great chain across the opening, making it impossible for any vessel to enter or leave without permission. These towers also housed catapults and other engines of war, ensuring that any ship attempting to force passage would be destroyed before it could enter the harbour. Guards stationed in these towers maintained constant vigilance, using polished metal mirrors to signal information about approaching vessels to watchtowers throughout the city. The dockyards within the great harbour represented one of the wonders of the ancient world. Each warship had its own covered slip, carved from the rock and roofed with timber and stone, creating a vast network of protected berths where vessels could be maintained and repaired away from the elements. These slips were arranged with mathematical precision, ensuring maximum efficiency in launching and recovering ships, while also creating an aesthetic harmony that transformed what might have been merely functional into something approaching art. The shipbuilding facilities adjacent to these docks employed thousands of craftsmen who had inherited and refined their skills through countless generations. They worked with woods specially selected and treated to resist the ravages of salt water, using joining techniques that created hulls of extraordinary strength and flexibility. The tools they employed, many made from the mysterious orichalcum, could shape wood with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. Between the outer and middle rings of land lay the second circle of water, 2 stadia wide and navigable by the largest vessels in the Atlantean fleet. This waterway served as more than just a defensive moat. it was a major thoroughfare for the transport of goods and people throughout the city. Barges laden with produce from the Great Plain, stone from the quarries, and timber from the mountains moved constantly along this circular canal, their movement regulated by harbour masters who ensured smooth traffic flow. The bridges that crossed this middle waterway were marvels of engineering, rising high enough to allow tall masted ships to pass beneath, while remaining stable enough to bear the weight of heavy cargo and crowds of people. These bridges were supported by pillars sunk deep into the bedrock beneath the canal, pillars that had been treated with substances that prevented erosion and made them impervious to the constant assault of water and weather. The middle ring of land, 2 stadia in width, contained the residences of the merchant class and skilled artisans who formed the backbone of Atlantean prosperity. Here, the architecture became more elaborate, with houses of 2 and 3 stories featuring courtyards, gardens, and fountains fed by the ingenious water distribution system that brought fresh water from the central springs to every part of the city. The streets in this district were paved with fitted stones, crowned in the center to shed rain into carefully designed drainage channels that prevented flooding even during the heaviest downpours. The wall that protected this middle ring was covered entirely with tin, another feat of metallurgy that demonstrated Atlantean mastery over materials. This tin coating was not applied as simple sheets, but had been somehow fused to the stone beneath, creating a surface that never corroded or required replacement despite centuries of exposure to the elements. The tin had been worked with subtle textures and patterns that caught the light differently depending on the viewing angle, creating an ever-changing display of silver luminescence. Within this middle ring stood numerous temples dedicated to various deities besides Poseidon for the Atlanteans, while recognizing their special relationship with the sea god, also honored other immortals. These temples, though smaller than the great sanctuary at the city's heart, were nonetheless impressive structures, each designed according to the specific attributes of the deity it honored. The Temple of Apollo featured a roof of gold that blazed in the sunlight, while that of Artemis was surrounded by a grove of trees that flourished despite being planted in what was essentially an artificial island. The innermost ring of water, 1 stadium wide, was crossed by a bridge of particular magnificence, for this was the route by which the kings and high nobles passed to reach the central island. This bridge was wide enough for several chariots to cross abreast, and its railings were decorated with statues of sea creatures wrought in precious metals. Beneath this bridge, a tunnel had been cut through the rock, allowing smaller vessels to pass from the middle waterway to the inner harbour without obstructing traffic above. The wall of the innermost ring bore the most precious coating of all, being entirely covered with orichalcum that flashed with its characteristic red-gold fire. This was not a thin veneer, but a substantial covering that had required enormous quantities of the precious metal, a display of wealth that exceeded anything known in the ancient world. The gates in this wall were also of orichalcum, massive portals that could be closed and barred against any threat, though in the long centuries of Atlantean dominance they had stood open as symbols of the empire's confidence in its power. The central island, 5 stadia in diameter, contained the Holy of Holies of the Atlantean world. Here stood the palace complex that had grown over countless generations, from the original dwelling Poseidon had created for Plato into a vast architectural symphony that incorporated the work of thousands of years. Each king in the line of Atlas had felt obligated to add to and improve upon the palace, not from mere vanity, but from a desire to honor their divine ancestor with ever greater magnificence. The palace buildings covered much of the central island, connected by covered walkways, gardens, and courtyards that created a flowing integration of interior and exterior spaces. The architecture combined massive stone construction with delicate decorative elements, showing that the builders had mastered both the monumental and the intimate scales of design. columns of marble supported roofs of precious wood, while walls of fitted stone were pierced by windows of translucent stone thin enough to admit light while maintaining privacy. The throne room of the High King was a space that inspired awe, even in those accustomed to magnificence. The ceiling rose to a height of 100 feet, supported by columns of green stone, shot through with veins of gold. The floor was a single expanse of polished black stone, so perfectly smooth that it reflected the ceiling above like a dark mirror. The throne itself had been carved from a single block of white stone, positioned so that at certain times of day, sunlight would fall upon it through carefully placed windows, causing the king seated there to appear illuminated by divine radiance. But the greatest structure on the central island was the Temple of Poseidon, a building that surpassed all others in both size and splendor. The temple measured a full stadium in length, 3 plethra in width, and reached a height that made it visible from far out at sea. The exterior was covered entirely with silver, except for the pinnacles, which were of gold, creating a structure that seemed to glow with its own light even on the darkest nights. The interior of the temple was even more magnificent than its exterior suggested. The ceiling was of ivory, worked throughout with patterns of gold, silver, and orichalcum that depicted the creation of Atlantis and the genealogies of the royal lines. The walls were covered with silver, but this was merely a backdrop for the incredible artistic treasures they supported. Paintings, sculptures, and reliefs created by master artists over millennia transformed the temple into a gallery of divine and heroic imagery. At the center of the temple stood the colossal statue of Poseidon that was one of the wonders of the ancient world. The god was depicted standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, the entire group carved from a single block of ivory and gold so large that the god's head nearly touched the temple's lofty ceiling. Around the base of this central statue were arranged 100 nereids riding dolphins, these smaller figures also of gold, representing the sea nymphs who served as Poseidon's court. The altar before this great statue was of proportions to match, large enough that entire bulls could be sacrificed upon it during the great ceremonies. This altar was not a simple block but a complex structure containing chambers and channels that allowed the blood of sacrifices to flow in prescribed patterns, creating temporary sacred designs before being carried away to the sea through underground conduits. The temple complex included numerous auxiliary buildings that served various religious and administrative functions. There were houses for the priests who maintained the eternal flames that burned before Poseidon's image, storehouses for the vast treasures donated by worshippers over the centuries, and workshops where artisans created the sacred objects used in religious ceremonies. Libraries within the temple precinct contain not only religious texts, but also the accumulated knowledge of Atlantean civilization, making the temple a center of learning as well as worship. The sacred groves that surrounded the temple featured trees from every part of the Atlantean Empire, creating a botanical collection that served both religious and educational purposes. These groves were maintained by a special class of priest gardeners who understood not only horticulture, but also the symbolic significance of each plant. Certain trees were believed to be especially sacred to Poseidon, and their wood could only be harvested for specific religious purposes under particular astronomical conditions. Water features throughout the central island created a constant music of fountains and cascades. The hot and cold springs that Poseidon had originally created for Plato had been channeled into an elaborate system that supplied baths, pools, and fountains throughout the palace and temple complexes. Some of these baths were open to the sky, surrounded by columns and statues, while others were enclosed in buildings where the steam from hot springs created an atmosphere of mystery and relaxation. The Atlanteans had developed a system for heating buildings using the hot springs, channeling the warm water through pipes beneath floors and within walls. This innovation allowed them to maintain comfortable temperatures even during the cooler months, a luxury that seemed miraculous to visitors from less advanced civilizations. The palace and temple were thus comfortable in all seasons, neither too hot in summer nor too cold in winter. The royal baths were particularly elaborate, with separate facilities for men and women, and special baths reserved for the kings alone. These were not merely places for cleansing, but social centers where important discussions took place and political alliances were forged. The main bath hall could accommodate hundreds of people simultaneously, with pools of different temperatures and mineral compositions, each believed to have specific healthful properties. Gardens throughout the central island displayed the Atlantean mastery of landscape architecture. These were not wild natural spaces, but carefully designed environments where every tree, shrub, and flower bed had been placed according to aesthetic and symbolic principles. Some gardens were designed for contemplation, with winding paths that led to secluded groves where philosophers could debate and poets could find inspiration. Others were more formal, with geometric patterns of plants and water features that reflected the mathematical harmony beloved by the Atlanteans. The palace complex included facilities for entertainment on a grand scale. There was an amphitheater where dramatic performances and musical concerts were held, its acoustics so perfect that even whispers from the stage could be heard clearly in the highest seats. A hippodrome allowed for chariot races and equestrian displays, with stables that housed horses of exceptional beauty and speed, bred through generations of careful selection. The royal workshops produced objects of extraordinary craftsmanship that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. Goldsmiths, jewelers, weapons makers, and other artisans worked with materials gathered from throughout the empire, creating pieces that combined different traditions and techniques into uniquely Atlantean forms. The crown jewels of Atlantis, worn by the High King during state ceremonies, were said to include gems of such size and brilliance that they seemed to capture and hold the light of stars. Beneath the central island ran a network of tunnels and chambers that served multiple purposes. Some were storage areas for the vast quantities of food, wine, and other supplies needed to maintain the palace population. Others contained the machinery that operated the various mechanical marvels of the city, including the pumps that maintained water pressure in the fountains and the mechanisms that opened and closed the great gates. Still others were secret passages known only to the royal family, allowing them to move unseen through their domain or to escape in the event of an emergency that never came. The architectural techniques employed in these constructions showed a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. The Atlanteans knew how to calculate loads and stresses, how to create arches and domes that could span great distances without support, and how to build foundations that would remain stable despite the island's occasional earthquakes. They understood the properties of different building materials and how to combine them for maximum strength and durability. Life within the rings of Atlantis followed rhythms established over millennia, patterns of work and leisure, duty and celebration that had evolved to create a society of remarkable stability and prosperity. The Egyptian priests who preserved these memories emphasized to Solon that understanding Atlantean society required looking beyond the monuments and temples to examine how ordinary citizens lived their daily lives, for it was in these mundane details that the true character of the civilization could be discerned. The social fabric of Atlantis was woven from countless individual threads, each person contributing their particular skills and efforts to the maintenance of an empire that spanned far beyond their island home. The day in Atlantis began before dawn for most citizens, with the sound of bronze bells ringing from towers throughout the city to announce the approaching sunrise. These bells did not merely mark time, but communicated complex information through different patterns of ringing, alerting various professions when their workday should begin, warning of approaching weather changes, or summoning citizens to public assemblies. The bell ringers were highly trained specialists who inherited their positions through family lines, maintaining traditions of timing and tone that had been refined over centuries. In the outer ring, the maritime quarter came alive with particular intensity as sailors prepared their vessels for departure, checking rigging, loading supplies, and making offerings to Poseidon for safe voyages. The fish markets opened while stars still shone overhead, as fishing boats that had worked through the night brought in their catches to be sold fresh to householders and restaurant keepers. The smell of the sea permeated this district, mixing with the aromas of tar, fresh wood, and the cooking fires where dock workers prepared their morning meals. The common sailors of Atlantis lived lives of constant motion between sea and shore, spending months on trading voyages or naval patrols before returning home to brief periods of rest with their families. Their quarters in the outer ring were modest but comfortable, typically consisting of 2 or 3 rooms arranged around a small courtyard where children played and women worked at looms or prepared food. Despite their humble circumstances, these maritime families took pride in their contribution to Atlantean power, decorating their homes with shells, coral, and small treasures brought back from distant lands. The shipbuilders and naval architects occupied a slightly higher social position, their specialized knowledge earning them respect and better compensation. These craftsmen worked in guilds that carefully guarded their technical secrets, passing knowledge from master to apprentice through years of careful instruction. An apprentice shipbuilder might spend 7 years learning his craft, beginning with simple tasks like preparing pitch and gradually advancing to the complex calculations required to design a vessel that would be both swift and seaworthy. Moving inward through the city's rings, the population became progressively more affluent and educated. The middle ring housed merchants who managed the flow of goods throughout the empire, scribes who maintained the extensive records required by Atlantean bureaucracy, and artisans who produced luxury goods for local consumption and export. These middle-class citizens typically owned their homes, multi-story structures with ground-floor shops or workshops and living quarters above. A typical merchant family might rise with the bells to begin their day, with prayers at the household shrine, a small altar where images of ancestors and favored deities received daily offerings of incense and wine. The father would then proceed to his place of business, perhaps a warehouse near the canal, where goods from across the empire were stored, awaiting distribution. The mother might manage the household accounts, supervise servants, and educate younger children in basic literacy and arithmetic, skills considered essential for all Atlantean citizens above the laboring classes. The education system of Atlantis was remarkably comprehensive for its time, with public schools available even to children of modest means. These schools, supported by taxes and temple donations, taught reading and writing in the Atlantean script, basic mathematics, music, and physical training. Children attended from age 7 to 14, with those showing particular aptitude continuing to higher institutions where they might study philosophy, advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, or engineering. The Atlantean script itself was a source of pride, a system of writing that could express both practical information and abstract concepts with precision. Unlike the pictographic systems used by some contemporary civilizations, Atlantean writing employed phonetic symbols that could be combined to represent any word in their language or even approximate foreign terms. This flexibility made their script invaluable for trade and diplomacy, allowing for clear communication across linguistic boundaries. Physical education held special importance in Atlantean society, reflecting their belief that a sound body was necessary for a sound mind. Every citizen, male and female, was expected to maintain physical fitness throughout their life. The gymnasiums found in each ring of the city were not mere athletic facilities, but social centers where citizens gathered to exercise, bathe, and discuss politics and philosophy. These establishments featured running tracks, wrestling grounds, swimming pools fed by the city's abundant water supply, and spaces for ball games whose rules have been lost to time. The role of women in Atlantean society was more prominent than in many ancient civilizations, though still distinct from that of men. While they could not serve in the military or hold certain governmental positions, women could own property, manage businesses, serve as priestesses, and practice medicine. The daughters of wealthy families received education comparable to their brothers, and several female philosophers and poets were honored in Atlantean memory for their contributions to culture and thought. Marriage customs in Atlantis balanced personal choice with family interests. While marriages among the nobility were often arranged for political advantage, common citizens had greater freedom to choose their partners. The marriage ceremony itself involved complex rituals that united not just two individuals but two family lines, with ancestors invoked to witness and bless the union. Divorce was permitted under certain circumstances, with laws that protected the rights of both parties and ensured the welfare of any children. The military organization of Atlantis was perhaps the most impressive aspect of their society, representing a level of systematic organization that would not be matched in Europe for millennia. Every male citizen was required to undergo military training beginning at age 15, learning not just combat skills but also discipline, logistics, and the importance of coordinated action. This universal military education created a population that could be mobilized rapidly in times of war while maintaining civilian productivity during peace. The professional military corps consisted of career soldiers who dedicated their lives to perfecting the arts of war. These men were organized into units based on their home districts, creating a sense of local pride and competition that improved overall performance. Each of the 10 kingdoms maintained its own forces, but all were trained according to standardized methods that allowed them to operate together seamlessly when combined for major campaigns. The Atlantean army was organized around a decimal system that facilitated command and control. 10 men formed a squad under a decarch, 10 squads formed a company under a centurion, 10 companies formed a battalion under a chiliarch, and so forth up to the level of entire armies. This hierarchical structure allowed for both flexibility in small unit tactics and coordination in massive battles involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The naval forces of Atlantis were even more sophisticated than their land armies. The empire maintained different classes of vessels for different purposes, from swift scout ships that could outrun any pursuer to massive war galleys that served as floating fortresses. The crews of these ships were not slaves or pressed men, but professional sailors who took pride in their skills and competed fiercely for positions on the most prestigious vessels. Naval tactics employed by the Atlanteans showed remarkable sophistication, including coordinated maneuvers that required precise timing and communication between ships. They had developed systems of flag signals that allowed admirals to control fleet movements even in the chaos of battle, and their navigators could maintain formation even in darkness or fog using techniques that remained mysterious to their enemies. The agricultural system that fed this complex society was no less impressive than its military organization. The Great Plain that occupied much of Atlantis had been transformed through centuries of careful management into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. An elaborate network of canals brought water from mountain streams to every part of the plain, allowing for irrigation during dry periods and drainage during excessive rains. The main canal that surrounded the plain was a massive construction, 100 feet wide and uniformly 50 feet deep, extending for nearly 2,000 miles around the perimeter of the agricultural district. From this primary channel, straight canals ran at regular intervals across the plain, creating a grid pattern that divided the land into manageable sections while providing transportation routes for agricultural products. Each section of the agricultural grid, measuring approximately 10 square miles, was assigned to a district administrator responsible for maintaining productivity and meeting tax obligations. These administrators were not mere overseers, but educated professionals who understood soil management, crop rotation, and the complex logistics of agricultural production. They maintained detailed records of planting and harvest dates, weather patterns and yield variations, building a database of agricultural knowledge that improved efficiency over time. The farmers who actually worked the land employed techniques that showed remarkable understanding of agricultural science. They practiced crop rotation to maintain soil fertility, alternating grain crops with legumes that restored nitrogen to the earth. They understood the value of leaving fields fallow periodically and of ploughing under certain plants to enrich the soil. Animal manure was systematically collected and distributed as fertilizer, and sophisticated composting systems transformed organic waste into rich, growing medium. The variety of crops grown in Atlantis exceeded anything known in contemporary civilizations. Besides the standard grains of wheat and barley, they cultivated numerous vegetables, fruits, and nuts, many unique to their island. They had developed techniques for grafting fruit trees that produced multiple varieties on a single trunk, and their vineyards yielded grapes that made wines renowned throughout the ancient world for their quality and variety. Animal husbandry in Atlantis showed equal sophistication. They maintained different breeds of cattle for milk, meat, and labor, understanding the principles of selective breeding centuries before such knowledge became common elsewhere. Their horses were legendary for their speed and endurance, the product of careful breeding programs that matched mares and stallions based on detailed genealogies and performance records. The Atlanteans had domesticated several animals unknown to other civilizations, including a type of large bird that provided both eggs and meat, and a small mammal valued for its exceptionally warm fur. They maintained vast aviaries where exotic birds were raised both for food and for their beautiful plumage, which was used in ceremonial costumes and religious decorations. Trade formed the lifeblood of Atlantean prosperity, connecting their island empire to regions as distant as the Americas, Africa, and northern Europe. The merchants of Atlantis had developed sophisticated financial instruments that facilitated long-distance trade, including letters of credit that could be redeemed in distant ports, and insurance systems that spread the risk of maritime ventures among multiple investors. The trading posts established by Atlantis throughout the known world served not just commercial but also diplomatic and intelligence functions. These outposts were typically fortified compounds that included warehouses, residential quarters for Atlantean merchants and their families, temples to Poseidon, and facilities for repairing and provisioning ships. They served as centers for cultural exchange, spreading Atlantean knowledge and techniques, while gathering information about local resources and political conditions. The goods that flowed through Atlantean trade networks were remarkably diverse. From the north came amber, furs, and tin. From Africa came gold, ivory, and exotic animals. From the east came spices, silk, and precious stones. In exchange, Atlantis exported manufactured goods of exceptional quality, including metalwork, textiles, and weapons that commanded premium prices in foreign markets. The Atlantean monetary system was based on a combination of precious metals and standardized commodity units. Gold and silver coins bearing the image of Poseidon circulated throughout the empire, their purity and weight guaranteed by royal seal. For larger transactions, standard measures of grain, oil, or wine might be used as currency, with central warehouses issuing receipts that could be traded like modern banknotes. The technological achievements of Atlantis extended far beyond what might be expected from an ancient civilization. They had developed machines that could lift enormous weights using principles of leverage and mechanical advantage that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Their understanding of hydraulics allowed them to create pumps that could raise water hundreds of feet, fountains that could project streams in complex patterns, and locks that allowed ships to navigate between bodies of water at different levels. In metallurgy, the Atlanteans had achieved mastery that seemed almost magical to contemporary observers. They could create alloys with specific properties, making metals harder, more flexible, or more resistant to corrosion as needed. Their technique for working with orichalcum, whatever its true composition, produced a metal that maintained its luster without polishing and could be drawn into wires finer than human hair, or hammered into sheets thin enough to be translucent. The Atlanteans understood principles of optics that allowed them to create lenses for magnification and instruments for astronomical observation. Their astronomers had mapped the heavens with remarkable accuracy, predicting eclipses, tracking the movements of planets, and developing a calendar that required no adjustment for centuries. This astronomical knowledge was not merely academic, but was applied to navigation, agriculture, and religious ceremonies. Medicine in Atlantis combined empirical observation with theoretical understanding to achieve results that seemed miraculous to outsiders. Atlantean physicians could perform surgical procedures including the removal of cataracts, the setting of complex fractures, and even certain operations on internal organs. They understood the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection and had developed antiseptic substances from plant and mineral sources. The pharmaceutical knowledge of Atlantis was extensive, with hundreds of medicines derived from plants, minerals, and animal products. They had drugs that could induce sleep for surgery, others that could reduce fever or ease pain, and compounds that could treat conditions from digestive disorders to mental illness. This medical knowledge was recorded in detailed texts that described symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, creating a systematic approach to healthcare. Architecture and engineering in Atlantis showed understanding of principles that would not be formally described elsewhere for millennia. They understood how to calculate structural loads, how to create foundations that would remain stable in earthquake-prone regions, and how to design buildings that would maintain comfortable temperatures through passive ventilation and thermal mass. Their acoustical engineering in theaters and temples showed mathematical precision in manipulating sound waves. The Atlanteans had developed a form of concrete that could harden underwater, allowing them to construct harbor installations and bridge foundations that seemed impossible to other civilizations. This material, created from a mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and other ingredients, actually became stronger over time when exposed to seawater, a property that modern science has only recently begun to understand. The transformation of Atlantis from a blessed island kingdom into a vast imperial power did not occur suddenly, but unfolded across centuries of gradual expansion, each generation pushing the boundaries of their influence further into the unknown world. The Egyptian priests who recounted this history to Solon emphasized that the Atlantean Empire at its height controlled territories and trade routes that spanned from the frozen seas of the north to the burning deserts of Africa, from the mysterious lands beyond the Western Ocean to the ancient kingdoms of the Mediterranean. This expansion was not merely the product of military conquest, but represented a complex process of exploration, colonization, diplomacy, and cultural assimilation that transformed the known world. The initial phases of Atlantean expansion had been driven more by curiosity and commerce than by imperial ambition. The descendants of Poseidon possessed an inherent affinity for the sea, and their ships ventured ever further from their island home in search of new lands and peoples. These early expeditions were led by younger sons of noble families who sought to make their fortunes through trade and adventure, carrying with them the blessings of their priests and the protection of their gods. The first territories to fall under Atlantean influence were the smaller islands scattered throughout the Atlantic, many of which were uninhabited or populated by primitive peoples who offered little resistance to the technologically superior newcomers. These islands served as stepping stones for further exploration, providing safe harbors where ships could resupply and repair during long voyages. The Atlanteans established permanent settlements on the most strategically located of these islands, building smaller versions of their ringed capital cities that served as administrative centers for regional control. As their confidence and capabilities grew, the Atlanteans began to explore the continental coastlines that bordered the Great Ocean. They established trading posts along the western shores of Africa and Europe, choosing locations where natural harbors offered protection and rivers provided access to inland regions. These posts gradually evolved from simple commercial outposts into fortified cities that projected Atlantean power deep into continental interiors. The expansion into the Mediterranean world represented a crucial turning point in Atlantean history. The Pillars of Hercules, which had once marked the boundary of their world, became merely a gateway to new conquests. The Atlantean fleet entered the Mediterranean not as traders seeking commercial opportunities, but as conquerors intent on establishing permanent dominion over this enclosed sea and the rich lands that surrounded it. The first Mediterranean territories to experience Atlantean power were those of Libya, the vast North African region that stretched from Egypt's western border to the Atlantic coast. The various tribal kingdoms and city-states of Libya, accustomed to their independence and mutual rivalries, were unprepared for the coordinated assault of a unified imperial force. The Atlanteans employed a strategy of divide and conquer, offering alliance and protection to some cities while destroying others that resisted, gradually building a network of dependencies that acknowledged Atlantean supremacy. The conquest of Libya provided the Atlanteans with enormous resources, particularly gold from mines in the interior, exotic animals for their arenas and temples, and vast numbers of soldiers who could be recruited or conscripted into their ever-growing armies. The Libyan cavalry, mounted on swift desert horses and skilled in rapid maneuver warfare, became a valued component of Atlantean military forces. Their techniques adapted and improved through Atlantean training and equipment. From their Libyan bases, the Atlanteans pushed eastward toward Egypt, though here they encountered a civilization as ancient and sophisticated as their own. The Egyptian priests told Solon that their ancestors had successfully resisted Atlantean expansion, maintaining their independence through a combination of military strength, diplomatic skill, and the protection of their gods. The Nile, with its annual floods and the deserts that bordered it, created natural defenses that even Atlantean engineering could not easily overcome. The relationship between Atlantis and Egypt during this period was complex, alternating between conflict and cooperation as circumstances dictated. Trade continued even during periods of tension, with both civilizations recognizing the mutual benefits of economic exchange. Egyptian grain fed Atlantean armies during their campaigns, while Atlantean metals and manufactured goods found ready markets in Egyptian cities. This pragmatic approach to international relations showed that the Atlanteans, despite their military might, understood the value of maintaining stable relationships with powerful neighbors. The European expansion of Atlantis proceeded along different lines than their African conquests. The numerous tribal peoples of Western and Southern Europe lacked the political unity and technological sophistication to mount effective resistance against Atlantean forces. The invaders offered these peoples a choice between subjugation and annihilation, and most chose to accept Atlantean overlordship rather than face destruction. The Atlanteans brought significant benefits to their European subjects, introducing advanced agricultural techniques, architectural knowledge, and systems of law and administration that transformed primitive societies into organized provinces of the empire. They built roads that connected previously isolated communities, established markets where goods could be traded safely, and imposed a peace that ended the constant warfare between tribal groups. Many Europeans came to view Atlantean rule as beneficial, providing security and prosperity in exchange for tribute and military service. The Atlantean approach to imperial administration showed remarkable sophistication and flexibility. Rather than attempting to impose uniform systems throughout their diverse territories, they adapted their governance to local conditions and traditions. In regions with established political structures, they often retained native rulers as client kings, requiring only acknowledgement of Atlantean supremacy and regular tribute payments. In less organized territories, they appointed Atlantean governors who ruled directly, supported by garrisons of soldiers and administrators trained in the capital. The tribute system that financed the Atlantean Empire was carefully calibrated to extract maximum revenue without destroying the productivity of subject territories. Each region was assessed based on its resources and capabilities, with tribute taking various forms depending on local specialties. Agricultural regions provided grain and livestock, mining districts sent precious metals and stones, forested areas supplied timber and pitch, while populous regions contributed soldiers for the imperial armies. The cultural impact of Atlantean expansion extended far beyond political and economic changes. The Atlanteans brought with them their languages, religions, technologies, and social customs, creating a process of cultural fusion that transformed both conquerors and conquered. In many territories, local deities were identified with Atlantean gods, creating syncretic religious systems that combined elements from different traditions. The Atlantean language became the lingua franca of international trade and diplomacy throughout their empire, much as Greek and Latin would later serve similar functions in the Mediterranean world. Children of local elites were sent to Atlantis for education, returning to their homelands as cultural ambassadors who spread Atlantean values and practices. This created a cosmopolitan ruling class that, while maintaining local identities, shared common cultural references and administrative techniques. The architectural legacy of Atlantean expansion could be seen in cities throughout their empire, where local building traditions were enhanced with Atlantean engineering knowledge. The characteristic circular patterns of Atlantean city planning appeared in modified forms in numerous settlements, adapted to local topography and resources. Aqueducts, harbors, and fortifications built using Atlantean techniques provided lasting infrastructure that continued to benefit these regions long after the empire's fall. The military strategies that enabled Atlantean expansion evolved continuously as they encountered different enemies and environments. Their original advantages in metallurgy, naval technology, and organizational sophistication were supplemented by lessons learned from conquered peoples. They adopted and improved upon the cavalry tactics of nomadic peoples, the siege techniques of eastern kingdoms, and the guerrilla warfare methods of mountain tribes. The Atlantean military doctrine emphasized combined arms operations that coordinated infantry, cavalry, naval forces, and siege engines in complex campaigns. They understood the importance of logistics in sustaining military operations far from home, establishing supply depots and communication lines that could support armies of unprecedented size. Their engineers accompanied every military expedition, building roads and bridges to facilitate movement, constructing fortified camps that provided security during campaigns, and developing siege equipment capable of reducing the strongest fortifications. Naval supremacy remained the foundation of Atlantean power throughout their imperial expansion. Their fleets controlled the sea lanes that connected different parts of the empire, suppressing piracy and ensuring safe passage for merchant vessels. The Atlantean Navy had developed specialized vessels for different functions, including troop transports that could deliver entire armies across vast distances, supply ships that could sustain fleets at sea for months, and hospital ships that provided medical care for wounded sailors and soldiers. The technological superiority of Atlantean warships was maintained through constant innovation and improvement. They had developed catapults that could launch projectiles from moving ships with reasonable accuracy, fire weapons that could project burning substances onto enemy vessels, and reinforced rams that could pierce the hulls of opposing ships without sustaining damage. Their naval architects experimented continuously with hull designs, sail configurations, and construction materials, seeking every possible advantage in speed, maneuverability, and durability. The war with ancient Athens represented the greatest challenge to Atlantean expansion and ultimately marked the beginning of their decline. According to the Egyptian priests, Athens at this time was not the city known to Solon, but an earlier incarnation, a powerful state that had united much of Greece under its leadership. This Athens possessed its own proud military traditions and advanced civilization, though lacking the naval power and technological advantages of Atlantis. The conflict began when Atlantean forces attempted to extend their control into the eastern Mediterranean, threatening the independence of Greek city-states that had maintained their freedom for generations. Athens, recognizing the existential threat posed by Atlantean expansion, organized a coalition of Greek states to resist the invaders. This alliance, though inferior in resources to the Atlantean Empire, possessed advantages in motivation, knowledge of local terrain, and the tactical brilliance of Greek military leadership. The war between Atlantis and the Athenian coalition raged for years across multiple theaters of conflict. Atlantean fleets bombarded Greek coastal cities, while Greek armies resisted invasion attempts with fierce determination. The mountainous terrain of Greece, so different from the open plains where Atlantean armies typically excelled, favored the defensive tactics employed by Greek forces. The Greeks developed innovative tactics to counter Atlantean technological advantages, using mobility and knowledge of local conditions to offset superior numbers and equipment. The Athenians proved particularly adept at naval warfare despite their inferior fleet size. They employed smaller, more maneuverable vessels that could operate in coastal waters where larger Atlantean ships struggled. Greek fireships sent against Atlantean fleets during night attacks caused disproportionate damage and psychological impact. The Athenians also developed networks of spies and saboteurs who disrupted Atlantean supply lines and gathered intelligence about enemy movements. The turning point in the war came when Athens stood alone, its allies having been defeated or having made separate peace with Atlantis. Despite facing the full might of the Atlantean Empire without support, the Athenians continued to resist with remarkable courage and determination. The Egyptian priests described battles of epic proportion, where Athenian citizen soldiers faced professional Atlantean armies and somehow prevailed through superior tactics, intimate knowledge of their homeland, and the inspiration of fighting for their freedom. The Athenian victory over Atlantis shocked the ancient world and demonstrated that the empire was not invincible. The specific details of how Athens achieved this triumph were unclear even to the Egyptian priests, who suggested that divine intervention might have played a role in humbling Atlantean pride. Some accounts spoke of brilliant strategic deceptions that lured Atlantean forces into catastrophic ambushes, while others described heroic last stands that inspired such fierce resistance that the invaders lost the will to continue. The defeat by Athens marked a crucial psychological turning point for the Atlantean Empire. For the first time, subject peoples saw that their masters could be defeated, that Atlantean armies were not invincible, and that resistance was possible. Though the empire did not immediately collapse, the myth of Atlantean invincibility had been shattered, and rebellions began to break out in various provinces as word of the Athenian victory spread. The Atlanteans attempted to restore their prestige through punitive campaigns against rebellious territories, but these efforts increasingly resembled desperate attempts to maintain control rather than confident exercises of imperial power. The costs of maintaining the empire, always substantial, began to exceed the benefits as more resources were required to suppress revolts and maintain garrisons in hostile territories. The cultural influence of Atlantis on conquered territories persisted even as political control weakened. Technologies and techniques introduced by the Atlanteans continued to be used and developed by subject peoples who had learned their value. Agricultural practices, architectural knowledge, and administrative systems originally imposed by imperial administrators were retained and adapted by local populations who recognized their practical benefits. The linguistic legacy of Atlantean expansion could be traced in loan words and grammatical structures that appeared in languages throughout their former empire. Place names of Atlantean origin survived in corrupted forms, marking ancient boundaries and settlements. Religious practices introduced or influenced by Atlantean beliefs persisted in folk traditions and mystery cults that preserved elements of the imperial religion long after its official temples had fallen into ruin. The economic networks established during Atlantean expansion proved remarkably durable, with trade routes and commercial relationships surviving the political fragmentation that followed imperial decline. Merchants continued to use Atlantean weights and measures. Contracts were still written in formulae derived from Atlantean legal traditions, and the gold and silver coins bearing Poseidon's image remained acceptable currency in markets from Britain to Egypt. The military innovations developed during Atlantean expansion influenced warfare throughout the ancient world. Tactics and strategies originally employed by Atlantean armies were studied and adapted by successor states, while weapons and armor of Atlantean design were copied by smiths who attempted to recreate their superior qualities. The organizational principles of Atlantean military forces, particularly their hierarchical command structure and emphasis on combined arms operations, became models for later armies. The intellectual legacy of Atlantean expansion included not only practical knowledge but also philosophical and scientific concepts that enriched human understanding. Atlantean mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy were preserved in fragments by scholars in various traditions, contributing to the accumulated wisdom that would eventually flower in classical Greek civilization. Medical knowledge originally developed in Atlantis saved countless lives as it was transmitted through generations of healers. The memory of Atlantean expansion served as both inspiration and warning for subsequent empires. The achievement of uniting vast territories under a single authority demonstrated what human organization and ambition could accomplish, while the ultimate failure of the empire warned against the dangers of overextension and hubris. Later conquerors studied accounts of Atlantean campaigns, seeking to emulate their successes while avoiding their mistakes. The seeds of Atlantis' destruction were sown not through military defeat or economic collapse, but through a gradual erosion of the very qualities that had made their civilization great. The Egyptian priests explained to Solon that the decline of Atlantis illustrated a pattern repeated throughout history, where success breeds complacency, power corrupts virtue, and material wealth displaces spiritual wisdom. What had begun as a society blessed by divine favor and guided by sacred law slowly transformed into something unrecognizable, a hollow shell of its former glory that maintained the outward forms of greatness while losing the inner substance that had given those forms meaning. The dilution of divine blood through successive generations was perhaps the most fundamental change in Atlantean society. The original sons of Poseidon had possessed not only physical superiority, but also an inherent nobility of character that inclined them toward justice, wisdom, and moderation. As these founders married mortal women and their children did likewise, each generation contained less of the divine essence that had set the Atlanteans apart from ordinary humanity. By the final centuries of the empire, the royal families could trace their lineage back to Poseidon through genealogies that spanned thousands of years, but the divine spark had become so faint as to be virtually extinguished. This biological dilution was accompanied by a corresponding spiritual decline that manifested in changing values and priorities throughout Atlantean society. Where earlier generations had valued wisdom above wealth, service above self-interest, and harmony above dominance, their descendants increasingly pursued material accumulation, personal aggrandizement, and power for its own sake. The shift was gradual enough that each generation barely noticed the change, seeing themselves as maintaining traditions while actually transforming them beyond recognition. The wealth that flowed into Atlantis from its vast empire accelerated this moral decay by removing the challenges and constraints that had once fostered virtue. The early Atlanteans had needed to work together, to practice discipline and self-sacrifice, to earn their prosperity through effort and ingenuity. Their descendants inherited wealth beyond imagination without effort, power without responsibility, and luxury without limit. The very success of their ancestors became a curse that weakened their character and clouded their judgment. The temples and religious observances that had once united Atlantean society in shared purpose gradually became empty rituals performed from habit rather than conviction. Priests continued to conduct the ancient ceremonies, but many had forgotten the deeper meanings behind the symbols and words they employed. The sacrifices to Poseidon became occasions for display and competition among the wealthy, who sought to outdo each other in the magnificence of their offerings while caring little for the spiritual significance of the acts. Young Atlanteans of noble birth increasingly viewed their religious duties as burdensome obligations to be fulfilled with minimum effort, rather than sacred privileges connecting them to their divine heritage. They would appear at temples for mandatory observances, but spent their time gossiping about politics and commerce rather than contemplating eternal truths. The mystery schools that had once transmitted profound wisdom became social clubs where the children of elites networked for advantage while going through the motions of spiritual instruction. The sacred laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar, which had governed Atlantean society since its founding, came to be interpreted in ways that served the interests of those in power rather than the principles of justice they were meant to uphold. Clever legal scholars found loopholes and ambiguities that allowed the wealthy and powerful to evade responsibilities while maintaining technical compliance with the letter of the law. The spirit of the law, which emphasized mutual support and collective welfare, was forgotten in favor of interpretations that maximized individual advantage. The requirement that the 10 kingdoms should never wage war against each other was maintained in form but violated in substance through economic warfare, political manipulation, and covert operations that stopped just short of open conflict. Kings would undermine their rivals through trade restrictions, diplomatic intrigues, and support for internal dissensions while maintaining the pretense of brotherhood. The council meetings that had once been occasions for genuine consultation became theatrical performances where predetermined decisions were ratified through hollow ceremonies. Corruption spread through the administrative apparatus of the empire like a disease, with officials at every level seeking personal enrichment rather than public service. Positions that had once been earned through merit and maintained through competence became commodities to be bought and sold, inherited and traded. Tax collectors enriched themselves by overcharging citizens and pocketing the difference. Judges sold verdicts to the highest bidder, and military commanders sold supplies meant for their troops while reporting them as consumed in service. The merchant class, which had once taken pride in honest dealing and quality craftsmanship, increasingly engaged in deceptive practices to maximize profits. Goods were adulterated with inferior materials, weights and measures were manipulated, and contracts were written with deliberately obscure language designed to trap the unwary. The reputation for reliability that had made Atlantean merchants welcome throughout the world was squandered for short-term gains that enriched individuals while undermining the empire's commercial foundations. The educational system that had been one of Atlantis's greatest achievements deteriorated as teachers focused more on political indoctrination and social conformity than on genuine learning. Students were taught what to think rather than how to think, memorizing approved interpretations rather than developing critical reasoning. The libraries that had preserved knowledge from throughout the empire were neglected, their scrolls crumbling while funds meant for their maintenance were diverted to more immediately profitable ventures. Scientific and technological progress, which had characterized earlier periods of Atlantean history, slowed and eventually ceased as the society became more concerned with luxury than innovation. The techniques for working orichalcum were gradually forgotten as master craftsmen died without properly training successors who were more interested in quick profits than patient mastery. Engineering knowledge that had enabled the construction of great works was reduced to mere maintenance of existing structures, with each repair less skillful than the original construction. The military, once the proud guardian of Atlantean civilization, became an instrument of oppression and exploitation rather than protection and order. Soldiers who had formerly been citizen warriors defending their homeland became professional mercenaries, primarily concerned with plunder and personal advancement. The discipline and coordination that had made Atlantean armies invincible eroded as commanders pursued individual glory rather than collective victory. The treatment of subject peoples grew increasingly harsh as the Atlanteans sought to extract ever greater tribute to fund their luxurious lifestyles. Where earlier generations had brought benefits to conquered territories through infrastructure, education, and peaceful trade, later Atlanteans viewed their subjects merely as resources to be exploited. Rebellions were suppressed with excessive brutality, creating cycles of resentment and revenge that required ever greater military forces to control. Social inequality reached levels that would have horrified the founders of Atlantis, with vast disparities between the wealthy elite and the common citizens. The rings of the capital city, originally designed to create harmonious zones serving different functions, became rigid barriers separating social classes. The poor were restricted to the outer rings, forbidden from entering the inner sanctums except as servants, while the wealthy isolated themselves in palaces that grew ever more elaborate and disconnected from the reality of ordinary life. The communal meals and public festivals that had once united citizens across social divisions became segregated affairs where different classes celebrated separately. The wealthy held private banquets featuring exotic foods and entertainments that cost more than a common family could earn in a lifetime, while the poor made do with simple fare and remembered better days. The sense of shared identity and common purpose that had defined Atlantean society fragmented into mutual suspicion and resentment. Family structures that had provided social stability for millennia began to break down as traditional values were abandoned. Marriages among the elite became purely political or economic arrangements devoid of affection or commitment, with infidelity so common as to be expected. Children were raised by servants and tutors rather than parents, growing up without emotional connections or moral guidance. The ancestor worship that had connected generations was neglected, with tombs falling into disrepair and genealogies forgotten. The role of women in society, which had been relatively progressive in earlier periods, deteriorated as they were increasingly viewed as ornaments or property rather than partners and contributors. The priestesses who had maintained important religious traditions were marginalized, their mysteries mocked by sophisticated urbanites who considered such practices primitive superstitions. Female scholars and artists found their work dismissed or attributed to male relatives, their contributions erased from official records. Strange portents began to appear with increasing frequency as the moral decay deepened, signs that the Egyptian priests interpreted as warnings from the gods about the approaching catastrophe. Fish in the harbors were found dead without apparent cause, their bodies washing up on shores in vast numbers that created a stench throughout the capital. Birds that had nested in the city for countless generations suddenly abandoned their roosts, flying away in great flocks that darkened the sky. The hot and cold springs that Poseidon had created for Plato began to behave erratically, sometimes flowing with such force that they flooded surrounding areas, other times drying up completely for days or weeks. The water that did flow often had strange colors or odors, as if contaminated by some underground corruption. Some interpreted these changes as signs that Poseidon was withdrawing his blessing from his wayward descendants, though skeptics attributed them to natural causes. Earthquakes, always a hazard in Atlantis, became more frequent and severe, causing damage that the declining engineering skills of the population struggled to repair. Cracks appeared in the great walls that had stood unmarred for millennia, and some of the ancient bridges required constant maintenance to remain safe for use. The palace complex expanded and modified so many times that its structure had become labyrinthine, developed instabilities that required sections to be abandoned. The harvests that had always been abundant began to fail with increasing regularity, as if the earth itself was rejecting the corruption of its inhabitants. Plagues affected crops that had been cultivated successfully for thousands of years, while new pests appeared that seemed immune to traditional control methods. The Great Plain that had been the agricultural heart of Atlantis produced lower yields despite increased effort, forcing the importation of food from subject territories that could ill afford to provide it. Mental and spiritual ailments became epidemic among the population, with many citizens suffering from anxieties, depressions, and manias that healers could neither explain nor cure. Some individuals claimed to receive visions of impending doom, describing catastrophes that would destroy the empire and everything it had built. These prophets were generally dismissed as madmen, though their predictions were remembered and discussed in whispers by those who sensed that something fundamental had gone wrong with their society. The priest class, those who should have provided moral guidance during this crisis, was divided between reformers who called for a return to ancient virtues and accommodationists who justified the new order through creative reinterpretations of religious doctrine. Some priests attempted to warn the population about the spiritual dangers they faced, organizing revival movements that briefly attracted followers before being suppressed or co-opted by the authorities. Others simply withdrew into their temples, maintaining the old rituals for the few who still cared while waiting for the inevitable judgment. A few voices called for fundamental reforms that might have arrested or reversed the decline, proposing returns to the original laws of Poseidon, redistribution of wealth to reduce inequality, and restoration of the citizen-soldier tradition that had built the empire. These reformers were typically marginalized, exiled, or eliminated by those who benefited from the corrupt system, their ideas dismissed as nostalgic romanticism incompatible with the sophisticated modern world Atlantis had become. The response of the ruling class to these various warning signs was not reform but retrenchment, using their power to suppress dissent and maintain their privileges regardless of the cost to society. Laws were passed making it illegal to speak against the government or to spread false prophecies that might disturb public order. The military was increasingly deployed against the empire's own citizens, crushing protests and enforcing compliance with increasingly arbitrary edicts. The corruption extended even to the sacred ceremony of the bull sacrifice, the most solemn ritual connecting the kings to their divine ancestor. The bulls chosen for sacrifice were no longer the finest specimens but inferior animals whose owners had bribed the temple officials. The kings performed the ritual mechanically, their thoughts on political schemes and commercial ventures rather than divine communion. Some even sent representatives to perform their duties while they attended to what they considered more important matters. The orichalcum pillar containing Poseidon's laws, which had stood at the center of religious and political life since the founding of Atlantis, was gradually forgotten except as a historical curiosity. Tourists from the provinces were shown the pillar as part of guided tours of the temple, but few could read the ancient script, and fewer still understood the significance of the words. The sacred metal itself had lost its luster, tarnished by neglect and the spiritual pollution that permeated the temple. Trade relationships that had been built on trust and mutual benefit over centuries deteriorated into exploitation and sharp practice. Atlantean merchants adulterated goods, broke contracts when profitable, and used military threats to enforce unfair terms. The reputation for honesty that had made Atlantean currency accepted throughout the known world was destroyed, with traders in foreign ports increasingly demanding payment in raw gold or silver rather than Atlantean coins. The scientific and philosophical traditions that had distinguished Atlantean civilization entered a period of sterile scholasticism, with scholars more concerned with defending orthodox interpretations than pursuing new knowledge. Debates that had once explored fundamental questions about nature and existence degenerated into semantic arguments about the precise meaning of ancient texts. The experimental method that had produced Atlantean technological superiority was abandoned in favor of appeals to authority and tradition. Art and literature, which had flourished during the empire's golden age, became formulaic and derivative, endlessly recycling themes and styles from the past without innovation or authentic expression. Poets wrote elaborate verses praising wealthy patrons rather than exploring truth or beauty, while sculptors and painters produced technically proficient but spiritually empty works that decorated the palaces of the elite. The theatre, once a venue for exploring moral and philosophical questions, became a place for spectacular entertainments that distracted the population from their declining circumstances. The final years before the catastrophe saw an acceleration of all these negative trends, as if the society was rushing toward its doom with increasing velocity. The division between rich and poor became absolute, with intermediate classes eliminated through economic manipulation. The subject territories were in open revolt, requiring military forces that Atlantis could no longer effectively maintain. Natural disasters increased in frequency and severity, each one causing damage that was poorly repaired or simply abandoned. Yet even in these final days, the majority of Atlanteans seemed unable or unwilling to recognize the mortal danger they faced. They continued their pursuits of pleasure and profit, convincing themselves that the empire's troubles were temporary setbacks that would be overcome as they always had been. The warnings of priests and prophets were dismissed as the ravings of fanatics, while the evidence of social and environmental collapse was explained away through increasingly elaborate rationalizations. The hubris that had replaced wisdom as the defining characteristic of Atlantean society reached its apex in the belief that they were too great to fall, that their civilization was eternal and their power unlimited. They had forgotten that their greatness had been a gift from the gods, contingent on their maintaining the virtues and observing the laws that had been established at their founding. In abandoning these principles, they had severed the connection to divinity that had been the true source of their strength. The dawn that broke over Atlantis on what would be its final day appeared at first like any other, with the sun rising from the eastern waters to paint the brass walls of the outer ring with golden light. The citizens who stirred in their beds, the merchants preparing their wares for market, the priests kindling the sacred fires in the temples, none suspected that before another sunrise their entire world would vanish beneath the waves. Yet there were those who later claimed to have felt something different in the air that morning, a heaviness, a stillness, as if the earth itself was holding its breath before releasing a terrible sigh. In the palace at the center of the great city, the last king in the line of Atlas arose from troubled dreams that had plagued him throughout the night. He had seen visions of his ancestors, not as the glorious figures depicted in palace artwork, but as sorrowing spirits who turned their faces away from him in shame. Poseidon himself had appeared, not in his benevolent aspect as father of the royal line, but as the Earth-shaker, the destroyer, his eyes burning with divine fury at what his descendants had become. The king dismissed these visions as the product of too much wine at the previous evening's banquet, yet his hands trembled as his servants dressed him in his ceremonial robes. The morning proceeded with the usual routines that had governed life in Atlantis for millennia, though careful observers might have noticed subtle irregularities that hinted at the approaching catastrophe. The sacred flames in Poseidon's temple, which had burned steadily since time immemorial, flickered and danced erratically, sometimes roaring up to scorch the ceiling, other times dying down to mere embers despite the priest's desperate efforts to maintain them. The temple cats, usually calm and dignified creatures, prowled restlessly through the sacred precincts, yowling with voices that sounded almost human in their distress. At approximately the 3rd hour after sunrise, the first earthquake struck, a sharp jolt that lasted only moments but was felt throughout the island. Buildings swayed, pottery fell from shelves, and the water in the circular canals sloshed against their walls with unusual violence. Such earthquakes were not unknown in Atlantis, and after the initial alarm, most citizens returned to their activities, joking nervously about Poseidon's morning temper. The engineers dispatched to inspect the city's infrastructure reported minor damage, cracks in some of the older structures, but nothing that couldn't be repaired with routine maintenance. The second earthquake came at midday as the sun reached its zenith, and this one was different in both character and intensity. Rather than a sharp shock, it was a rolling motion that seemed to come from deep within the earth, as if some vast creature was stirring from age-long sleep. The ground undulated like water, making it impossible to stand, while buildings that had endured centuries swayed beyond their limits and began to collapse. The great statue of Poseidon in the central temple rocked on its base, and though it did not fall, many saw this as the most terrifying omen of all. The intervals between earthquakes grew progressively shorter as the day wore on, each tremor more violent than the last. By mid-afternoon, continuous shaking made normal activities impossible, and panic began to spread through the population. The circular canals, disturbed by the Earth's movement, began to overflow their boundaries, sending walls of water cascading through the streets. The careful geometric order that had defined the city for millennia dissolved into chaos as desperate citizens sought safety wherever they could find it. The king convened an emergency council in the palace, though several of his advisors failed to appear, having already begun preparations to flee the city. Those who did attend argued frantically about the cause of the disasters and what response might save them. Some blamed foreign magic, suggesting that the defeated Athenians had somehow invoked divine powers against them. Others insisted it was a natural phenomenon that would pass, counseling patience and order. A few, including the high priest of Poseidon, declared that this was divine punishment for their abandonment of ancient virtues, though their calls for mass repentance were largely ignored. As the afternoon progressed into evening, new horrors emerged from the tortured earth. Fissures opened in the Great Plain, swallowing entire villages and the canal system that had irrigated the agricultural lands for thousands of years. The mountains on the northern edge of the island began to emit smoke and ash, revealing themselves as volcanoes that had slumbered since before human memory. The sky darkened with volcanic emissions, turning the sun into a dim red disk that cast an apocalyptic light over the dying empire. The hot and cold springs that had been Poseidon's original gift to Plato now became instruments of destruction, erupting with superheated water and steam that scalded anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. The very ground around these springs began to dissolve, creating expanding sinkholes that consumed buildings and monuments that had stood since the founding of the city. The palace complex, built directly over the original springs, began to collapse section by section as its foundations were undermined by the boiling waters below. In the harbor, ships that might have offered escape were thrown against each other by tsunami waves generated by underwater earthquakes. The narrow entrance to the port, designed to protect against invasion, now became a death trap as desperate vessels tried to flee simultaneously, creating a tangle of broken masts and drowning sailors. Those few ships that managed to reach open water found seas so violent that many were overwhelmed and sank within sight of the island they were trying to escape. The priests in the various temples made desperate attempts to appease whatever divine powers had turned against them, performing emergency sacrifices and rituals that had not been conducted in centuries. Bulls were slaughtered on altars that shook and cracked beneath them, their blood mixing with the rain that had begun to fall in torrents. Ancient prayers were recited from crumbling scrolls, though many of the words were no longer understood, their meaning lost through generations of neglect. Some priests abandoned their posts entirely, fleeing with whatever temple treasures they could carry, while others remained at their altars until the very end, maintaining their vigils even as their temples collapsed around them. Among the general population, reactions varied from panic to resignation to a kind of hysterical celebration. Some citizens ran through the streets, seeking loved ones or trying to reach ships that might carry them to safety. Others gathered in public squares, praying together or simply holding each other as they waited for the end. In the wealthy inner rings, elaborate farewell banquets were hastily organized, with the elite choosing to meet death while indulging in final pleasures rather than fleeing in undignified terror. The knowledge that their civilization was ending sparked different responses in different people. Some scholars rushed to the libraries, trying desperately to save the most important texts by wrapping them in waterproof materials and loading them onto any available vessels. Artists attempted to preserve their masterworks, though most were forced to abandon them as the urgency of escape became paramount. The keeper of the royal archives made the heartbreaking decision about which records to save, ultimately choosing genealogies and legal codes over poetry and philosophy. As darkness fell, the violence of the Earth's convulsions reached a crescendo that defied human comprehension. The carefully maintained rings of land and water that had defined the city's structure began to break apart, with sections of land subsiding below water level while others were thrust upward into jagged cliffs. The circular symmetry that had symbolized divine order and human achievement was reduced to chaos, a broken landscape that bore no resemblance to the magnificent capital that had existed that morning. The volcanic mountains to the north erupted fully now, sending rivers of lava flowing toward the sea and launching massive boulders that crashed down upon fleeing refugees. The ashfall became so thick that breathing was difficult, while the heat from the lava turned rain into scalding steam. Lightning of extraordinary intensity struck repeatedly, drawn perhaps by the metal coverings of the city walls, adding electrical death to the catalogue of destructions being visited upon Atlantis. It was at midnight, according to the few survivors who managed to escape and preserve their testimony, that the final catastrophe began. The entire island started to sink, not gradually, but with terrifying speed, as if the seafloor had opened beneath it. The ocean rushed in from all directions, not as a single wave, but as a rising flood that consumed everything in its path. The outer ring disappeared first, its brass walls vanishing beneath the dark waters along with all the maritime quarters and harbours that had been the foundation of Atlantean power. The water rose with impossible speed, swallowing ring after ring of the great city. Those who had taken refuge on the higher ground of inner rings watched in horror as the sea climbed toward them, knowing that no elevation would be sufficient. The palace complex on the central island, the sacred center of Atlantean civilization, held out longest against the flood, but even it could not resist the divine judgment being executed upon the empire. The last king of Atlantis was said to have stood upon the highest tower of his palace, wearing the full regalia of his office and holding the scepter that symbolized 10,000 years of royal authority. As the waters rose around him, he neither prayed nor cursed, but simply watched the destruction of everything his ancestors had built, perhaps finally understanding that their greatness had always been conditional upon divine favor they had squandered. When the waves finally reached him, he did not struggle but allowed himself to be taken, the last of Poseidon's mortal line, returning to the sea from which his power had originated. The Temple of Poseidon, that magnificent structure that had housed the colossal statue of the god and the sacred orichalcum pillar of laws, held together even as the ground beneath it sank. Some survivors reported seeing it disappear beneath the waters intact, as if being reclaimed whole by the deity it honored. The last thing visible was the golden pinnacle of its roof, gleaming in the light of the volcanic fires, before it too slipped beneath the surface that closed over it like a burial shroud. The sinking of Atlantis was not uniform across the entire island, with some portions submerging quickly while others broke apart and sank in stages. This irregularity created temporary islands of survival where groups of Atlanteans found themselves stranded on fragments of their former homeland, surrounded by turbulent seas and falling ash. Some of these fragments held together long enough for their occupants to construct makeshift rafts from debris, though most eventually succumbed to the continuing earthquakes and volcanic activity. Those who managed to escape the immediate destruction faced the challenge of survival in seas made nearly impassable by the catastrophe. The water was filled with debris from the destroyed civilization, including the bodies of countless victims, broken pieces of buildings, and the remnants of what had been the world's most powerful fleet. Volcanic ash continued to fall, creating a muddy paste on the ocean's surface that made breathing difficult and navigation nearly impossible. The tsunamis generated by Atlantis' sinking spread outward in all directions, carrying destruction to coastlines throughout the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Communities that had never heard of Atlantis were suddenly overwhelmed by walls of water that arrived without warning, adding thousands more casualties to the toll of the empire's fall. These waves carried with them artifacts of Atlantean civilization, depositing items of worked metal, carved stone, and other remnants in places far from their origin. Among those who escaped were members of the royal families who had been traveling abroad when the catastrophe struck, merchants who had been on trading voyages, and diplomatic missions to foreign courts. These survivors found themselves suddenly stateless, carrying memories of a homeland that no longer existed, and knowledge of a civilization that would soon pass into legend. Some were welcomed by former subject peoples who remembered Atlantean rule favorably, while others were turned away or enslaved by those who saw opportunity in the empire's fall. The priests who survived carried with them what religious texts and ritual objects they had managed to save, establishing temples in foreign lands where they attempted to maintain Atlantean religious traditions. These exile temples became centers for refugee communities, places where survivors could gather to mourn their losses and preserve what they could of their culture. Over time, these traditions would merge with local beliefs, creating syncretic religions that preserved elements of Atlantean theology in altered forms. Some survivors attempted to establish new Atlantean colonies in uninhabited lands, hoping to recreate their lost civilization on a smaller scale. These efforts generally failed due to lack of resources, internal conflicts, and the absence of the natural advantages that had made the original Atlantis so successful. Within a generation or two, most of these attempted colonies had either been abandoned or absorbed into surrounding populations, their Atlantean identity preserved only in family legends and place names. The technological knowledge of Atlantis carried by refugee engineers and craftsmen influenced development in various parts of the world, though much was lost due to lack of appropriate materials and infrastructure. Techniques for working metal, constructing buildings, and organizing agriculture were passed on where possible, contributing to advances in societies that had contact with Atlantean survivors. However, the most advanced knowledge, particularly the secrets of orichalcum and the engineering principles behind the great circular city, died with those who had possessed it. The immediate aftermath of Atlantis' destruction saw significant climatic effects throughout the region. The massive volcanic eruptions had released enormous quantities of ash and gas into the atmosphere, creating a temporary cooling that affected agriculture for several years. The disruption of ocean currents caused by the sinking landmass altered weather patterns, bringing unusual storms and droughts to areas that had previously enjoyed stable climates. The political vacuum created by the sudden disappearance of Atlantean power led to widespread conflict as former subject states competed for resources and territory. Trade networks that had been maintained by Atlantean naval power collapsed, leading to economic disruption throughout the known world. Some regions descended into chaos and barbarism, while others, like Athens, emerged strengthened from the experience of successful resistance. The location where Atlantis had stood became a region of dangerous waters that sailors learned to avoid. Strange currents, unexpected storms, and fields of floating pumice made navigation hazardous for generations. Some reported seeing ghostly lights beneath the waters on calm nights, while others claimed to hear the sound of bells tolling from drowned temples when conditions were right. These waters became known as cursed, and elaborate rituals were developed by mariners to protect themselves when forced to travel through them. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as severe trauma, experiencing nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to adjust to life in their adopted homes. The guilt of survival, the grief for all that was lost, and the knowledge that their civilization's sins had brought about its destruction created a complex emotional burden that many carried for the rest of their lives. Children who survived the catastrophe grew up with confused memories of magnificence and terror, unable to fully reconcile their recollections with the reality of their reduced circumstances. They passed on to their own children's stories that grew more fantastic, with each telling, mixing genuine memories with imagination until it became impossible to separate fact from fiction. These stories became the seeds of myths that would spread throughout the world, each culture adapting the tale to fit its own understanding and needs. The documentary evidence of Atlantis' existence was largely destroyed in the catastrophe, with only fragments surviving in the archives of other civilizations. The Egyptian priests who preserved the most complete account did so as part of their mission to maintain humanity's historical memory, understanding that the story of Atlantis contained warnings relevant to all civilizations. They carefully copied and recopied the texts, ensuring that future generations would have access to this cautionary tale. As the immediate survivors aged and died, direct memory of Atlantis faded into second-hand accounts and eventually into legend. Details became confused, exaggerated, or forgotten entirely. The location of the sunken island became uncertain, with different traditions placing it in different seas. The nature of Atlantean society was romanticized or demonized depending on the teller's purpose, until the historical Atlantis was almost entirely obscured by the mythical versions that replaced it. The destruction of Atlantis sent ripples through human consciousness that extended far beyond the physical tsunamis that devastated ancient coastlines. In the generations that followed, as survivors spread throughout the world and their descendants struggled to make sense of inherited trauma, the story of a great civilization destroyed by divine wrath became woven into the mythological fabric of cultures across the globe. The Egyptian priests who spoke to Solon understood this phenomenon, explaining that what appeared to be separate myths were often refracted memories of the same catastrophic events, viewed through different cultural lenses and transformed by centuries of retelling. The most universal of these echoes was the flood narrative, variations of which appeared in the sacred traditions of peoples from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from India to Ireland. While each culture shaped the story according to its own beliefs and needs, certain elements remained remarkably consistent, suggesting a shared memory of catastrophic inundation that had affected humanity on a global scale. The timing, cause, and meaning of the flood varied, but the image of water rising to consume human civilization appeared again and again, as if the collective unconscious could not forget the trauma of that terrible drowning. In Mesopotamian tradition, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and later incorporated into Hebrew scripture, the flood was sent by deities disappointed with humanity's behavior, sparing only a righteous remnant who preserved life through the construction of an ark. The parallels to the Atlantis narrative were striking, particularly the theme of divine judgment against human corruption and the survival of a few who would begin civilization anew. Some scholars among the Egyptian priests suggested that these Mesopotamian floods myths might preserve memories of the same period of catastrophes that had destroyed Atlantis, viewed from the perspective of Eastern peoples who experienced the disasters differently. The Indian tradition spoke of multiple cycles of creation and destruction, with floods marking the transitions between cosmic ages. The Puranas described how Manu, the progenitor of humanity, was warned by the god Vishnu about an approaching deluge and instructed to build a vessel to preserve life through the catastrophe. The description of advanced civilizations existing before the flood, possessing knowledge and powers that would be lost in the destruction, echoed elements of the Atlantean story, suggesting that India too might have preserved memories of that lost world. Greek mythology itself contained multiple flood narratives beyond the Atlantis account, most notably the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a deluge sent by Zeus to punish human wickedness. The placement of this flood in different historical periods by different authors suggested that Greek memory had conflated multiple catastrophes, perhaps including both the destruction of Atlantis and other regional disasters. The theme of stones being transformed into people to repopulate the earth after Deucalion's flood might have reflected confused memories of survivors from stone-built Atlantean cities founding new settlements. The Norse traditions of Ragnarok, while primarily framed as a future prophecy, contained elements suggesting it might also preserve memories of past catastrophes. The description of the world being consumed by fire and flood, with only a few survivors emerging to rebuild civilization, paralleled the dual destruction of Atlantis by volcanic fire and oceanic inundation. The image of the Midgard serpent rising from the ocean to destroy the world could have been inspired by ancestral memories of the sea itself becoming an instrument of annihilation. In the Americas, indigenous peoples preserved traditions of great floods that had destroyed previous worlds or civilizations. The Aztec concept of multiple suns, each ending in catastrophe with the current age destined to end in earthquake, suggested cyclical destruction similar to those described by the Egyptian priests. The Maya spoke of a flood that had destroyed a race of wooden people who had failed to properly honor the gods, while Hopi traditions described the destruction of previous worlds through flood and fire when humanity strayed from proper behavior. These American traditions were particularly intriguing because they suggested contact with Atlantean civilization before its destruction. The advanced astronomical knowledge, pyramid construction, and sophisticated agriculture of pre-Columbian civilizations might have derived in part from Atlantean refugees or from contact with the empire during its expansion. Certain architectural and artistic similarities between American and Old World civilizations, previously attributed to independent development, might actually reflect a common Atlantean influence. The search for physical evidence of Atlantis had led investigators to examine numerous archaeological sites that might represent either the sunken island itself or colonies established by survivors. The Egyptian priests had been deliberately vague about the precise location of Atlantis, saying only that it lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, leaving later generations to speculate about where exactly the island might have been situated. This geographical uncertainty had resulted in Atlantis being sought everywhere from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, from the Caribbean to the Antarctic. The most compelling Mediterranean candidate for Atlantis was the island of Santorini, ancient Thera, where a massive volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE had destroyed an advanced Minoan settlement and generated tsunamis that devastated the eastern Mediterranean. The circular shape of Santorini's caldera, created by the volcanic explosion, resembled the ringed structure of Atlantis, while the sophisticated Minoan civilization that had flourished there showed numerous parallels to Plato's description. The bull worship central to Minoan religion, the advanced maritime technology, the elaborate palaces with sophisticated plumbing, and the sudden catastrophic destruction all suggested connections to the Atlantis narrative. The timing of Santorini's destruction, however, presented problems for those who sought to identify it directly with Atlantis. The Egyptian priests had been specific that Atlantis had fallen 9,000 years before Solon's time, not the mere 1,000 years that separated Solon from the Theran eruption. Some scholars attempted to resolve this discrepancy by suggesting errors in translation or transmission, proposing that years might have been confused with months, or that a decimal point had been misplaced. Others argued that Santorini might have been an Atlantean colony that preserved and repeated the pattern of the original's destruction. The Minoan civilization centered on Crete showed remarkable similarities to descriptions of Atlantean society. Their maritime dominance of the eastern Mediterranean, sophisticated urban planning, advanced art and architecture, and apparently peaceful prosperity during their height all echoed elements of the Atlantis story. The sudden decline of Minoan power following the Santorini eruption and subsequent invasions might have provided a historical template that influenced Plato's narrative, even if Crete itself was not Atlantis. Archaeological discoveries in the Atlantic Ocean had yielded tantalizing if inconclusive evidence for sunken civilizations. Underwater formations off the coast of Bimini in the Caribbean showed what appeared to be roads or foundations, though whether these were artificial constructions or natural limestone formations remained debated. Similar structures had been reported off the coasts of Spain, Portugal, and northwestern Africa, in locations that would have been above sea level during Ice Age periods when ocean levels were lower. The Canary Islands, inhabited by the mysterious Guanche people before Spanish colonization, had long been considered possible remnants of Atlantis. The Guanches possessed cultural elements that seemed anomalous for their isolated location, including mummification practices similar to those of ancient Egypt, pyramid structures, and a writing system that bore no clear relationship to other African or European scripts. Their legends spoke of their ancestors coming from a larger island that had sunk beneath the sea, forcing them to flee to their current homes. The theory that Atlantis might have been located in what was now the Caribbean Sea gained support from the presence of extensive underwater formations throughout the region. The shallow banks of the Bahamas, which would have been dry land during lower sea levels, showed patterns suggesting possible human modification. Some researchers proposed that the Gulf Stream's warm waters, described in ancient sources as making Atlantic navigation difficult, might have originated from the flooding of a large landmass in the Caribbean region. More extreme theories placed Atlantis in Antarctica, suggesting that the continent had once been ice-free and inhabited before a shift in the Earth's crust moved it to its current polar position. Proponents of this theory pointed to ancient maps that seemed to show Antarctica's coastline as it would appear without ice, though mainstream scholars attributed these to coincidence or misinterpretation. The idea that advanced civilizations might lie buried beneath Antarctic ice captured imaginations, but lacked archaeological support. The Azores, rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge, represented another popular candidate for Atlantis's location. These volcanic islands were situated approximately where Plato's description would place Atlantis, and their geology showed they had experienced significant volcanic activity and changes in elevation over geological time. Some of the islands showed evidence of having been much larger in the past, with submerged shelves extending far beyond their current shorelines. Celtic traditions from Ireland and Wales spoke of sunken lands to the west, kingdoms that had vanished beneath the waves in ancient times. The legend of High Brazil, an island that appeared and disappeared off the western coast of Ireland, might have preserved memories of Atlantean contact or colonies. Welsh stories of Cantref Gwaelod, a fertile kingdom lost to the sea, contained elements reminiscent of the Atlantis narrative, including the theme of moral decline leading to divine punishment through inundation. The underwater ruins reported off the coast of India, particularly near Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, suggested that major civilizations had been lost to rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. These sites, if confirmed as artificial structures, would date to periods consistent with the Egyptian chronology for Atlantis. Indian traditions of sunken cities like Dvaraka, described in ancient texts as magnificent maritime powers destroyed by the sea, showed remarkable parallels to the Atlantis story. Japanese waters had yielded mysterious underwater structures, particularly off Yonaguni Island, that some interpreted as evidence of pre-Diluvian civilization. These formations showed what appeared to be stairs, platforms, and carved surfaces, though whether they were natural or artificial remained controversial. The presence of similar structures throughout the Pacific suggested that if they were artificial, they represented a widespread civilization that had been submerged by rising seas. The notion that multiple civilizations might have suffered similar fates to Atlantis was supported by geological evidence of catastrophic events throughout human prehistory. The Younger Dryas period, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions around 12,800 years ago, had caused massive environmental disruption that could have destroyed coastal civilizations. The subsequent warming and sea level rise at the end of this period would have submerged vast areas of previously habitable land, potentially eliminating evidence of advanced cultures that had developed during the Ice Age. Genetic studies of human populations had revealed bottlenecks suggesting dramatic population reductions at various points in prehistory, consistent with catastrophic events that might have inspired flood myths. The distribution of certain genetic markers and linguistic patterns suggested ancient migrations that might have resulted from the displacement of populations by rising seas or other disasters. These scientific findings, while not proving the existence of Atlantis specifically, supported the possibility that advanced civilizations had been lost to catastrophe. The astronomical theories connecting Atlantis to cosmic catastrophes proposed that the destruction might have resulted from comet impacts, solar flares, or other celestial events. Some researchers noted that many flood myths included references to changes in the heavens, falling stars, or periods of darkness that might indicate astronomical phenomena. The dating of various catastrophe myths to similar periods suggested global events that had affected multiple civilizations simultaneously. The psychological interpretation of Atlantis myths across cultures revealed universal human anxieties about civilization's fragility and the consequences of moral decline. The repeated pattern of advanced societies destroyed by their own hubris appeared in traditions worldwide, suggesting either shared cultural memories or parallel psychological responses to the challenges of civilization. The flood myth served as a powerful metaphor for renewal and redemption, allowing cultures to imagine fresh starts free from the corruption of the past. The religious significance of flood narratives in various traditions showed how the Atlantis-type story had been incorporated into theological frameworks explaining divine justice, human sinfulness, and cosmic cycles. The transformation of historical catastrophes into moral lessons had helped preserve their memory while adapting their meaning to serve evolving spiritual needs. The universality of these themes suggested that the Atlantis story, whether based on a single historical event or multiple catastrophes, had touched something fundamental in human consciousness. The linguistic evidence for connections between supposedly unrelated ancient civilizations included similar words for flood, catastrophe, and divine punishment appearing in languages that should have had no contact. Place names in various parts of the world seemed to echo Atlantean nomenclature, though whether this represented actual historical connections or coincidental similarity remained uncertain. The names of gods and heroes in different mythologies showed patterns that might indicate common origins in Atlantean tradition. The technological parallels between ancient civilizations separated by vast distances and supposedly having no contact suggested possible Atlantean influence. Pyramid construction in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and Asia showed similarities that might indicate a common source of knowledge. Agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, and metallurgical processes appeared in different cultures at times that could be consistent with dissemination by Atlantean refugees or traders. The artistic and symbolic similarities between cultures, particularly the use of spirals, concentric circles, and certain animal motifs, might preserve Atlantean influence. The winged disc symbol appearing in Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and American art could represent a shared memory of Atlantean religious or technological imagery. The prevalence of dragon or serpent myths across cultures might reflect memories of Atlantean symbols or the destructive tsunamis that had ended their civilization. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples worldwide contained elements that resonated with the Atlantis story even when the cultures had no known contact with Greek or Egyptian sources. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories spoke of a time when the land was different before great floods reshaped the world. African traditions described ancient kingdoms with powerful magic that had been swallowed by water or sand. These parallels suggested either remarkable coincidence or genuine preserved memories of shared experiences. The modern search for Atlantis using satellite imagery, underwater robotics, and advanced dating techniques had revealed numerous previously unknown archaeological sites that, while not proving Atlantis's existence, showed that major civilizations remained undiscovered. The underwater cities off India, structures beneath the Black Sea, and settlements buried in the Sahara demonstrated that much of human history remained hidden, leaving room for the possibility that Atlantis, or something like it, might yet be found. The preservation of the Atlantis narrative through the medieval period represented a remarkable journey through the transformation of classical knowledge into Christian cosmology, where pagan wisdom was either suppressed, allegorized, or carefully integrated into theological frameworks. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Plato's dialogues containing the Atlantis story survived primarily in Byzantine libraries and Islamic centers of learning, where scholars continued to debate whether the tale was historical fact, philosophical allegory, or prophetic warning. The medieval mind, accustomed to interpreting the world through layers of symbolic meaning, found in Atlantis a rich source of moral instruction about pride, divine judgment, and the transitory nature of earthly power. Medieval cartographers faced a peculiar challenge when creating their Mapae Mundi, those elaborate world maps that attempted to reconcile biblical geography with classical knowledge and contemporary exploration. Some included Atlantis as a real place, positioning it in the Atlantic Ocean based on Plato's description, while others omitted it entirely or relegated it to the margins among the monstrous races and fantastic lands that populated the edges of the known world. The Hereford map, created around 1300, showed mysterious islands in the Atlantic that some interpreters believed represented memories of Atlantis, though whether the cartographer intended this connection remained uncertain. The Islamic scholars of the medieval period approached the Atlantis story with characteristic systematic analysis, attempting to reconcile it with Quranic descriptions of destroyed civilizations and prophetic warnings. Ibn Khaldun, the great 14th century historiographer, discussed Atlantis in the context of cyclical civilizations, seeing it as an example of how luxury and moral decay inevitably led to destruction. Islamic geographers like al-Masudi incorporated versions of the Atlantis story into their works, sometimes conflating it with other tales of sunken cities and lost kingdoms from Arabian and Persian traditions. The Renaissance brought a dramatic revival of interest in Atlantis as European scholars rediscovered classical texts and developed new frameworks for understanding ancient wisdom. The translation of Plato's complete works into Latin and vernacular languages made the Atlantis story widely available to educated Europeans for the first time in centuries. Marsilio Ficino's Latin translation of Plato, completed in 1484, presented Atlantis to a generation hungry for ancient knowledge and eager to find deeper meanings in classical narratives. The discovery of the Americas by European explorers created an intellectual revolution that gave the Atlantis story new relevance and urgency. Here was an entire continent unknown to classical geography, populated by civilizations that possessed pyramids, advanced astronomy, and complex societies reminiscent of Plato's descriptions. Francisco López de Gómara, writing in 1552, explicitly argued that the Americas were Atlantis, suggesting that indigenous peoples were descendants of Atlantean survivors who had forgotten their origins. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Spanish historian and advocate for indigenous rights, considered and ultimately rejected the Atlantis-America connection, but his detailed analysis showed how seriously the theory was taken by 16th century scholars. The similarities between Aztec and Inca civilizations and Plato's Atlantis were too striking to ignore, including the use of gold and silver in architecture, sophisticated water management systems, and traditions of ancient catastrophes that had destroyed previous worlds. Some Spanish conquistadors even used the Atlantis theory to justify their conquests, arguing they were reclaiming lands that had once belonged to the ancient Mediterranean world. Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published in 1627, reimagined Plato's narrative as a utopian vision of scientific progress and rational governance. Though Bacon's work was primarily philosophical rather than historical, it demonstrated how the Atlantis myth had evolved from a cautionary tale about hubris into an inspiration for human advancement. His placement of this ideal society in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic showed how the expansion of geographical knowledge had opened new possibilities for locating or reimagining Atlantis. The 17th and 18th centuries saw increasingly elaborate attempts to provide scientific explanations for the Atlantis story. Athanasius Kircher, the polymathic Jesuit scholar, published a map in 1665 showing Atlantis in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, oriented with south at the top according to Egyptian convention. Kircher believed volcanic activity had destroyed the island, a theory that seemed plausible given increased European knowledge of volcanic islands and submarine geology. The Enlightenment brought both skepticism and new methodologies to Atlantis research. Voltaire dismissed the story as fiction, while other philosophers saw it as an allegory for political and social principles. Yet even skeptics were intrigued by the possibility that the myth might preserve genuine historical memories. The Comte de Buffon, the influential naturalist, speculated about land bridges that might have connected continents in the past, providing a scientific framework for understanding how Atlantean influence could have spread globally. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century embraced Atlantis as a symbol of lost innocence and ancient wisdom, inspiring poets, artists, and mystics to elaborate on Plato's sparse description. William Blake incorporated Atlantean imagery into his mythological system, seeing the sunken continent as representing humanity's fall from primordial unity. Samuel Taylor Coleridge planned but never completed an epic poem about Atlantis, leaving only fragments that suggested his vision of it as a paradise lost through the corruption of natural harmony. Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882, marked a watershed moment in Atlantis research, bringing together geological, archaeological, and mythological evidence in a comprehensive argument for the historical reality of Plato's account. Donnelly, a former U.S. congressman and lieutenant governor of Minnesota, approached the subject with the systematic methodology of 19th century scholarship, even as his conclusions outran his evidence. His book became an international bestseller, inspiring a generation of explorers and researchers to search for physical proof of Atlantis. Donnelly's theories connected Atlantis to numerous archaeological mysteries, from the pyramids of Egypt to the mounds of the Mississippi Valley, from the megaliths of Europe to the ruins of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia. He argued that similarities in flood myths, language roots, cultural practices, and technological achievements across widely separated civilizations could only be explained by diffusion from a common Atlantean source. While many of his specific claims were later disproven, his interdisciplinary approach established a template for future Atlantis research. Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement incorporated Atlantis into an elaborate esoteric history of human evolution, describing multiple root races and continental configurations that mainstream science rejected but that attracted numerous followers seeking alternatives to materialist explanations of human origins. The theosophical version of Atlantis included advanced technologies powered by crystal energies, flying vehicles, and psychic abilities that would influence popular conceptions of the lost continent throughout the 20th century. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet, provided detailed descriptions of Atlantean civilization through thousands of readings given while in trance states between 1923 and 1944. Cayce described Atlantis as having possessed technologies surpassing those of the modern world, including energy crystals, flying machines, and the ability to manipulate genetic material. His prediction that evidence of Atlantis would be discovered in 1968 or 1969 near Bimini led to intense exploration of that area and the controversial discovery of the so-called Bimini Road. The development of sonar technology following World War II opened new possibilities for underwater exploration, allowing researchers to map the ocean floor with unprecedented detail. Maurice Ewing's discovery of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the 1950s initially excited Atlantis seekers who thought they had found the sunken continent's backbone, though further research showed this was a spreading zone where new seafloor was created rather than a submerged landmass. The mapping of the Atlantic Ocean floor revealed no evidence of a recently sunken continent, forcing Atlantis theories to become more sophisticated or relocate to other regions. The plate tectonic revolution of the 1960s provided a new framework for understanding how continents moved and ocean basins formed, effectively ruling out the possibility of a large continent sinking in the Atlantic within human history. This scientific advance did not end speculation about Atlantis but forced researchers to propose alternative explanations, such as smaller islands, coastal regions, lost to rising seas, or locations in entirely different parts of the world. The theory transformed from seeking a sunken continent to identifying possible archaeological sites that might have inspired Plato's narrative. Jacques Cousteau's underwater expeditions brought ocean exploration into public consciousness, inspiring hopes that technological advances would finally reveal Atlantis's location. Cousteau himself searched for Atlantis in the Mediterranean, particularly around Santorini, using advanced diving equipment and underwater cameras to document submerged ruins. While he found fascinating archaeological sites, including ancient harbors and shipwrecks, nothing matched the scale of Plato's described civilization. The space age brought satellite technology to Atlantis research, with remote sensing revealing previously unknown archaeological sites and geological features that might relate to the legend. Satellite images showed underwater structures in various locations, from the Bahamas to the coast of Spain, that appeared too regular to be natural formations. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry allowed researchers to detect buried structures without excavation, revealing lost cities in jungles and deserts that demonstrated how entire civilizations could disappear from historical memory. The discovery of hydrothermal vents and deep-sea ecosystems in the 1970s revealed that the ocean depths harbored environments and life forms previously thought impossible, rekindling speculation about what other surprises might lie beneath the waves. Submersibles capable of reaching the deepest ocean trenches allowed direct observation of areas that had been inaccessible throughout human history. While these expeditions found no sunken cities, they demonstrated how much of the ocean remained unexplored and how recently humanity had developed the tools to investigate it comprehensively. Computer modeling and virtual reconstruction techniques developed in the late 20th century allowed researchers to test hypotheses about Atlantis by simulating various scenarios of destruction and preservation. Models of tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and sea level changes showed how a civilization could be destroyed rapidly and completely, leaving little trace. Digital analysis of Plato's text using linguistic algorithms attempted to separate potential historical elements from philosophical elaboration. though results remained inconclusive and controversial. The advent of DNA analysis provided new tools for tracking human migrations and identifying genetic bottlenecks that might correspond to catastrophic events in human prehistory. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome patterns revealed population movements that sometimes correlated with flood myths and traditions of lost homelands. While these genetic studies could not prove the existence of Atlantis specifically, they demonstrated major demographic disruptions that might have inspired catastrophe myths. Marine archaeology advanced dramatically with the development of autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, that could explore depths and conditions impossible for human divers. These technologies revealed numerous submerged archaeological sites, from prehistoric settlements in the North Sea to ancient ports in the Mediterranean, showing that rising sea levels had indeed claimed significant human habitats. Each discovery renewed speculation about what larger sites might remain undiscovered. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s, demonstrated how a catastrophic flood could have occurred within human memory and inspired widespread flood myths. Their evidence that the Black Sea had been a freshwater lake until Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosphorus around 5600 BCE provided a model for how the Atlantis legend might have originated from a real but more limited catastrophe. This theory showed how scientific research could identify potential historical cause within mythological narratives. LiDAR technology, originally developed for atmospheric research, revolutionized archaeology by revealing structures hidden beneath vegetation and sediment. Surveys of coastal areas and shallow seas using airborne and satellite-based LiDAR identified numerous previously unknown archaeological features, including entire Maya cities hidden in Central American jungles. The technology's ability to penetrate water to limited depths raised hopes that it might reveal submerged structures related to Atlantis, though no definitive discoveries had yet been made. The 21st century brought crowdsourcing to Atlantis research, with online communities analyzing satellite imagery, sharing theories, and coordinating amateur investigations. Google Earth made it possible for anyone with an internet connection to search for potential Atlantis sites, leading to numerous claims of discoveries that, while usually proving to be natural formations or image artifacts, occasionally identified genuine archaeological features that warranted professional investigation. This democratization of exploration paralleled earlier eras when Atlantis captured public imagination. Recent underwater discoveries continued to fuel speculation about lost civilizations, even if none could be definitively linked to Atlantis. The submerged city of Dwarka off the coast of India, dating to at least 1500 BCE, showed that significant urban centers had been lost to rising seas. The Yonaguni monument near Japan, whether natural or artificial, demonstrated how difficult it could be to distinguish human construction from geological formation in underwater environments. These sites kept alive the possibility that Plato's Atlantis, or something that inspired it, might yet be found. Professional archaeologists remained generally skeptical about Atlantis while acknowledging that the search for it had motivated valuable research and discoveries. The quest had led to improved understanding of ancient civilizations, development of new technologies, and exploration of previously uninvestigated regions. Even if Atlantis itself never existed as Plato described, the search for it had expanded human knowledge in countless ways, making the myth productive regardless of its historical accuracy. The modern scientific consensus held that Plato's Atlantis was likely a philosophical fiction incorporating elements from various historical sources, including the Persian Wars, Minoan Crete, and possibly distant memories of real catastrophes. Yet the enduring fascination with the story and continued discoveries of previously unknown ancient sites meant that the search continued, driven by the tantalizing possibility that somewhere beneath the waves or buried in sediment lay evidence of a lost civilization that might have inspired one of humanity's most persistent legends. Current expeditions employed cutting-edge technology, including environmental DNA sampling, to detect traces of human activity in sediments, quantum magnetometry to identify buried structures with unprecedented precision, and artificial intelligence to analyze vast datasets for patterns that might indicate artificial constructions. Multidisciplinary teams brought together archaeologists, geologists, oceanographers, and data scientists in collaborative efforts that would have been impossible in earlier eras. While none had yet found Plato's Atlantis, each expedition added to the accumulated knowledge about human prehistory and the civilizations that had risen and fallen before recorded history began. The story of Atlantis has transcended its origins in Plato's dialogues to become something far greater than a tale of a sunken island, evolving into a mirror that reflects humanity's deepest fears, highest aspirations, and most profound questions about the nature of civilization itself. The endurance of this narrative across 24 centuries speaks not merely to its dramatic appeal, but to its ability to embody fundamental tensions within the human experience, tensions between progress and preservation, power and responsibility, material achievement and spiritual wisdom. Each generation has found in Atlantis what it most needed to find, whether cautionary tale, lost paradise, or promise of hidden knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. The psychological power of the Atlantis myth lies partly in its activation of what Carl Jung termed the collective unconscious, those deep structures of symbolism and meaning that appear across all human cultures. The image of a great city disappearing beneath the waves resonates with primordial fears of drowning, of being swallowed, of losing ground beneath our feet. These anxieties connect to infant memories of leaving the womb's aquatic safety and to evolutionary memories encoded in our genes from countless ancestors who feared floods, storms, and the vast unknowable ocean. When we hear of Atlantis sinking, something deep within us remembers and trembles, yet the myth also speaks to the profound human tendency toward nostalgia, the belief that there was once a golden age from which we have fallen and to which we might someday return. This pattern appears in virtually every culture's mythology, from the Garden of Eden to the Hindu Satya Yuga, from the Greek Golden Age to the Chinese mythology of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. Atlantis has become the secular West's primary expression of this archetype, a lost paradise that was destroyed not by divine whim but by human failings, making its loss both more tragic and more instructive. The influence of Atlantis on Western literature has been profound and multifaceted, providing authors with a flexible framework for exploring themes of hubris, loss, and the price of knowledge. Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea transformed Captain Nemo into a kind of Atlantean figure, a genius isolated from corrupt civilization who discovers the sunken continent's ruins and draws both inspiration and warning from them. Verne's Atlantis served as a reminder that technological advancement without moral progress leads inevitably to destruction, a theme that would resonate through science fiction literature for generations. Pierre Benoit's L'Atlantide relocated the lost continent to the Sahara Desert, creating an Atlantis that survived in hidden form, ruled by the immortal Queen Antinea, who collected the bodies of her lovers in a hall of red marble. This version emphasized the dangerous allure of ancient wisdom and the potentially corrupting nature of power preserved too long. Benoit's innovation of placing Atlantis in the desert rather than beneath the sea opened new possibilities for the myth, suggesting that losing something did not always mean it was destroyed, merely hidden or transformed. The 20th century's darkest moments gave the Atlantis myth new relevance as a meditation on how civilizations could destroy themselves through their own achievements. After 2 world wars that employed science in the service of mass destruction, the atomic age that threatened human extinction, and environmental degradation that endangered the planet itself, the story of a great civilization destroyed by its own hubris seemed less like ancient history and more like contemporary prophecy. Authors like Ursula K. Le Guin and Samuel R. Delany used Atlantean themes to explore how societies could lose their way despite or because of their power. Popular culture embraced Atlantis with enthusiasm that showed no signs of diminishing. From comic books where Aquaman ruled an underwater kingdom descended from Atlantis to animated films that reimagined the lost continent as a crystalline wonderland of ancient technology and mystical wisdom. Each interpretation reflected contemporary anxieties and aspirations, with Cold War versions emphasizing advanced weapons that destroyed their creators, New Age interpretations focusing on spiritual evolution and crystal power, and environmental interpretations warning about climate change and rising sea levels. The philosophical implications of the Atlantis myth extend far beyond its surface narrative of rise and fall. Plato likely intended the story as a thought experiment about the ideal state described in his Republic, showing what happened when a society that began with divine blessing and good laws gradually abandoned its founding principles. The progression from virtue to vice that he described was not inevitable but resulted from specific choices made by successive generations, each seemingly reasonable in isolation, but cumulatively fatal. The notion that prosperity contains the seeds of its own destruction has proven remarkably prescient in analyzing the fate of civilizations throughout history. The Roman Empire's fall, the collapse of the Maya civilization, the disappearance of the Indus Valley culture, and countless other historical examples seem to validate the Atlantean pattern of success leading to excess, leading to extinction. Modern economists and social theorists have formalized these observations into theories of institutional decay, elite overproduction, and complexity collapse that echo themes from Plato's ancient narrative. The environmental interpretation of Atlantis has gained particular urgency in an era of climate change and ecological crisis. The image of a civilization destroyed by rising waters speaks directly to contemporary fears about melting ice caps, coastal flooding, and extreme weather events. Island nations like Tuvalu and the Maldives, facing literal submersion due to sea level rise, have become modern Atlantises, their plight warning the rest of humanity about the consequences of environmental hubris. The myth provides a narrative framework for understanding how human actions can trigger natural responses that destroy the actors themselves. The technological reading of Atlantis reflects anxieties about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and other advances that might exceed human wisdom to control them. The descriptions of Atlantean superscience in various interpretations, from death rays to weather control, from telepathic communication to matter transformation, serve as metaphors for contemporary technologies that promise godlike power while threatening unforeseen consequences. The myth warns that the ability to do something does not necessarily mean it should be done, that power without wisdom is a road to catastrophe. In the warm afternoon light of ancient Athens around 360 BCE, an elderly philosopher sat in the shade of an olive grove, speaking to a small gathering of students about a story that had haunted Greek memory for generations. This man was Plato, and the tale he shared would echo through 24 centuries, becoming perhaps the most enduring mystery in all of human civilization. He spoke of an island empire that had once commanded the waters beyond the known world, a place of such magnificence and power that its very existence seemed to challenge the boundaries between history and myth. The story had come to Plato through his ancestor, Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens who had lived 2 centuries earlier. Solon had traveled extensively throughout the Mediterranean world, seeking wisdom and knowledge from distant lands. His most significant journey had taken him to Egypt, to the ancient city of Sais in the Nile Delta, where temples older than memory itself housed archives that stretched back into the dim reaches of time. There, in those sacred halls where hieroglyphs covered every wall and the air hung heavy with incense, Solon encountered priests who served as guardians of humanity's forgotten past. These Egyptian priests, weathered by years of study and meditation, regarded the Greeks with a mixture of affection and gentle condescension. To them, the Hellenic peoples were like children, their histories brief and their memories short. One elderly priest, his voice carrying the weight of countless generations of accumulated wisdom, told Solon that the Greeks knew nothing of the true antiquity of the world. Where Greek memory reached back perhaps a few hundred years, Egyptian records stretched into the thousands, preserving accounts of civilizations that had risen and fallen long before the first Greek city had been founded. The priests spoke of great floods and fires that had periodically swept across the earth, erasing civilizations and forcing humanity to begin anew. Each time these catastrophes occurred, most of the world's knowledge was lost, leaving only fragments and whispers of what had come before. But Egypt, blessed by the regular flooding of the Nile and protected by its unique geography, had been spared the worst of these disasters. In their temple archives, carefully preserved on papyrus scrolls and carved into stone, lay records of events that the rest of the world had forgotten. Among these ancient records was the story of Atlantis, a name that would become synonymous with lost glory and vanished dreams. According to the priests, 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, there had existed an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, positioned in the Atlantic Ocean just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, those towering rocks that marked the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast, unknown waters beyond. This placement, the priests emphasized, was crucial to understanding both the power and the ultimate fate of this lost civilization. The island of Atlantis had not been some barren rock jutting from the ocean, but rather a paradise blessed by nature with every advantage. The climate was mild throughout the year, neither too hot in summer nor too cold in winter, allowing for continuous cultivation and comfortable living. Fresh water flowed abundantly from natural springs, and the soil was so fertile that it produced 2 harvests annually without exhausting itself. Mountains rose in the northern portions of the island, providing protection from cold winds and offering slopes covered with forests of magnificent trees. The central portion of Atlantis consisted of a great rectangular plain measuring approximately 3,000 stadia in length and 2,000 stadia in width. This vast expanse of level ground had been improved over countless generations through an elaborate system of canals and irrigation channels that distributed water from the mountain streams throughout the agricultural lands. The precision and scale of this hydraulic engineering surpassed anything known in Solon's time, suggesting a level of mathematical and practical knowledge that seemed almost impossible for such an ancient period. But the most remarkable feature of Atlantis was its capital city, built at the southern edge of the Great Plain where a low mountain rose 50 stadia from the sea. This city defied conventional understanding of ancient architecture and urban planning. It consisted of a series of perfectly circular rings of land and water, alternating in a pattern that created 3 zones of water and 3 of land, with the original hill forming a central island. These rings were not natural formations, but had been carved from the earth itself by the founders of Atlantis, displaying an ability to reshape the landscape that seemed to belong more to the realm of gods than men. The dimensions of these rings had been calculated with mathematical precision. The central island measured 5 stadia in diameter, surrounded by a ring of water 1 stadium wide. Beyond this lay a ring of land 2 stadia wide, then another water ring of 2 stadia, then a land ring of 3 stadia, a water ring of 3 stadia, and finally the outermost ring of land. Each of these zones served specific purposes in the functioning of the city, creating a harmonious balance between defense, beauty, and practical utility. The waterways that separated these rings of land were not mere moats, but functioning canals deep enough and wide enough to allow the passage of the largest ships. Bridges spanned these waterways at regular intervals, their construction so solid that they had endured for thousands of years without requiring significant repair. Beneath these bridges, tunnels had been carved through the rock to allow ships to pass from one ring to another without obstruction, creating a complex network of waterways that made the entire city accessible by boat. The Atlanteans had covered the outer surfaces of their circular walls with metals that gleamed in the sunlight, creating a visual spectacle that could be seen from great distances at sea. The outermost wall was coated with brass, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the sky and clouds. The middle wall bore a covering of tin that shone with a silvery light, while the innermost wall, protecting the central citadel, was clad in orichalcum, a mysterious metal that the Egyptian priests described as having a red-golden fire that flashed in the light. This orichalcum appeared frequently in descriptions of Atlantis, clearly holding special significance for its people. The priests told Solon that this metal had been highly valued in those ancient times, second only to gold. Though by their own era only the name survived, the secret of its composition lost with Atlantis itself. Some surfaces within the most sacred buildings were entirely covered with orichalcum, and important inscriptions were carved into pillars of this gleaming substance. The population of Atlantis had developed over millennia from a relatively small founding group into a diverse and sophisticated society. The Egyptian priests described them as a handsome people, tall and well-proportioned, with features that suggested their partial divine heritage. They possessed a natural grace in movement and bearing that set them apart from other peoples, and their voices were said to be particularly melodious, capable of producing music of extraordinary beauty. Education in Atlantis began at an early age, with children learning not only practical skills, but also philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and the arts. The Atlanteans had developed a system of writing that allowed them to record their knowledge and pass it down through generations, though this script bore no resemblance to any writing system known to the Egyptians or Greeks. Their libraries contained vast collections of texts covering every aspect of human knowledge, from agricultural techniques to the movements of the stars. The society had been organized according to principles that balanced individual achievement with collective responsibility. While there were distinct social classes, mobility between them was possible through merit and service to the state. Craftsmen who produced exceptional work could rise in status, as could soldiers who distinguished themselves in service, or scholars who made significant discoveries. This system had helped maintain social harmony for thousands of years, preventing the rigid stratification that often led to unrest in other civilizations. The Atlanteans had been particularly advanced in their understanding of mathematics and engineering. Their ability to calculate and execute the precise circular design of their capital city demonstrated a mastery of geometry that would not be matched in the Mediterranean world for millennia. They understood the principles of water pressure and flow, allowing them to create fountains and water distribution systems that seemed magical to less advanced peoples. Their architect could construct buildings of enormous size that remained stable despite their height, using techniques of weight distribution and structural support that remained mysterious even to the learned Egyptian priests. In matters of metallurgy, the Atlanteans had surpassed all other ancient peoples. Besides their famous orichalcum, they could produce alloys of remarkable strength and beauty, combining different metals to achieve specific properties. Their weapons were said to be superior to anything possessed by their contemporaries, maintaining their edge through countless battles and never rusting despite exposure to salt air. They had also perfected techniques for working with precious metals, creating jewelry and decorative objects of such intricacy that they seemed beyond human capability. The maritime technology of Atlantis represented perhaps their greatest achievement. Their ships were larger and more seaworthy than any vessels known to the ancient Mediterranean world. Built from specially selected timbers treated with preservative compounds that protected them from rot and marine parasites, these ships could remain in service for decades with minimal maintenance. The Atlanteans had developed sophisticated navigation techniques that allowed them to sail far from sight of land, using observations of stars, currents, and bird flight patterns to find their way across vast expanses of open ocean. Their naval forces had been organized with remarkable efficiency. The capital city alone could mobilize 1,200 warships at short notice, each fully crewed and supplied for extended campaigns. These vessels were not merely transports for soldiers, but were designed specifically for naval combat, equipped with reinforced prows for ramming and platforms for archers and soldiers. The coordination required to manage such a fleet suggested a level of administrative sophistication that matched their technological capabilities. Agriculture in Atlantis had been developed to an extraordinary degree of productivity. The Great Plain, already fertile by nature, had been enhanced through careful cultivation and soil management techniques that maintained its richness generation after generation. The Atlanteans practiced crop rotation, understood the importance of leaving fields fallow, and had developed strains of grain that produced higher yields than wild varieties. They had domesticated numerous plants that were unknown in other parts of the world, creating gardens that combined beauty with utility. The priests told Solon that the Atlanteans had possessed knowledge of herbs and medicines that could cure diseases considered fatal in other lands. Their physicians understood the circulation of blood through the body, the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection, and the use of specific plants to treat various ailments. They had developed surgical techniques that allowed them to perform operations that seemed impossibly dangerous, with surprisingly high rates of success. The religious life of Atlantis centered on the worship of Poseidon, the god of the sea, who was considered the divine progenitor of their royal line. Yet their theology was complex and sophisticated, incorporating observations about natural phenomena and philosophical speculation about the nature of divinity. They believed in a cosmic order that governed both the physical and spiritual worlds, and their priests spent years studying the patterns and cycles that revealed this underlying harmony. Temples throughout Atlantis served not only as places of worship, but also as centers of learning and repositories of knowledge. The priests who served in these temples underwent lengthy training that encompassed theology, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They were responsible for maintaining the calendar, predicting astronomical events, and interpreting omens that might affect the state. Their influence on Atlantean society was considerable, though it was balanced by other power centers to prevent theocratic dominance. The legal system of Atlantis had evolved over thousands of years into a sophisticated code that addressed both criminal and civil matters. Laws were not arbitrary decrees, but were based on principles of justice and social harmony that had been refined through centuries of practical application. Judges were selected from among the wisest and most experienced citizens, and their decisions were guided by precedent as well as the specific circumstances of each case. The system included provisions for appeal and mechanisms to prevent corruption, showing an understanding of human nature and the temptations of power. Trade had been fundamental to Atlantean prosperity from the earliest times. The island's position in the Atlantic made it a natural hub for commerce between different regions, and the Atlanteans had cultivated trading relationships with peoples from Africa to northern Europe. They had developed standardized weights and measures that facilitated international trade, and their merchants were known for their honesty and reliability. The wealth generated by this commerce had funded the great public works and monuments that adorned their cities. The Atlanteans had also been skilled diplomats, often preferring negotiation to warfare in their international relations. They had developed elaborate protocols for receiving foreign ambassadors and conducting negotiations, understanding that ceremony and symbolism could be as important as substantive discussions in reaching agreements. Their treaties were carved in stone and metal, preserved in special archives that ensured their terms would be remembered and honored across generations. As Solon listened to these descriptions, he began to understand that Atlantis had represented a pinnacle of human achievement that made even the greatest accomplishments of his own time seem modest by comparison. The Egyptian priests spoke of a civilization that had solved problems that still plagued the Greek world, achieving a level of prosperity, harmony, and knowledge that seemed almost utopian. Yet underlying their account was a note of warning, a reminder that even the greatest human achievements were ultimately fragile. The priests explained that the records of Atlantis were preserved not merely as historical curiosity, but as a lesson for future generations. The story contained within it truths about the nature of power, the cycles of history, and the relationship between human ambition and divine justice. They insisted that Solon understand not just the facts of what had occurred, but the deeper meaning embedded in the narrative, the universal patterns that could be observed in the rise and fall of all great civilizations.